Dukakis now
Okay,
opening the mic.
Thanks, Tuan.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being a part of this. I've had kind of a rough winter and spring with 2 hospitalizations and pneumonia and surgery and a few other things, but fortunately, thanks to some great doctors, both on the West Coast and here, I seem to be recovering fairly quickly, and the doctors tell me I'm going to be fine. So it's good to be back with you, but if I don't sound quite as sharp as I would like to be, it's only because I've been coming through this period, and another month or so, and I should be okay. Anyway, no sense in long introductions. This is a very interesting world these days, I don't have to tell you. Much to do, much to discuss, as we try to build a world in which people get along with each other, countries get along with each other, and where at some point, won't be in my lifetime, we rule out war as a means for settling disputes between and among countries. A number of you have done really excellent work on this, and I'm looking forward to listening to you and discussing this, but this is a particularly important time, I think, for us to be doing this. We've had a slight change in schedule because Ian Duncan Smith has got some problems and is dealing with them in terms of the whole Hong Kong situation. So he's going to join us, I think, in about 45 minutes. And we're going to kick off this discussion, Miriam, with you, if that's okay. And then go to Joe. Duncan Smith, have a discussion with our panelists. You're all here. Then we'll break briefly and go to the second half of the meeting and finish up before noontime. But welcome all. Great to have you with us. And Miriam, let's begin with you.
Miriam.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and privilege for me, and honor to be able to share with all the honorable guests my views and thoughts, and maybe contribute to the discussion, hopefully. Thank you to Governor Dukakis for the invitation, and to Boston Global Forum. And thank you also for establishing the Democratic Alliance on Digital Governance, because this is a very timely and very, very important decision. The world could enjoy the results and the new digital technologies because the world was mainly in the hands of the democratic part of it. Digital technologies and AI were serving to support our freedom of thoughts, freedom of expression, could support the vulnerable people, the people with disabilities or people with diseases, elderly people. AI and digital technology could support transparency of our governance. But unfortunately, this is becoming all endangered because we have a big task to do, and is to remain the leaders who have these technologies and the development in our hands, in the hands of the democratic part of the world, in the hands of free people and free societies. I come from an ex-communist country, from Slovakia, and maybe I will share a little bit of history to shed certain light into the current developments in the world. The Soviets, during the Cold War, were focusing, as it seems to me, to 2 major issues. They were trying to gain universities and the intellectuals and the leaders from the West and put them on their side. We all remember the generation, or I don't remember, I was born after, but from books, we remember the generation of the 68, as we call it, young people, educated people who were admiring the Soviet system, the Soviet inhuman totalitarian regime, because they did not understand why the system cannot work and why it is so human and why it's not supporting freedom, but it's violating human rights. I had a discussion with a friend who practically was saying, like, why are you so obsessed by Putin? I mean, he's a part of the history, but still we should focus on other things. But we have to remember that Putin was part of the KGB, which was trying to develop ways of intellectual and industrial espionage, because the Soviet Union has realized that they have to catch up with the development. They have to catch up with the industrial and technological development of the West. Otherwise, they're not going to be able to compete further. Why I'm saying is that similar things are happening in our societies in the free part of the world already for some time. I used to work for the International Republican Institute, which is an American non-partisan organization, I have to stress. And our goal was to support democracy and freedom worldwide. By the way, this organization was founded by Ronald Reagan during his fight with the Soviet system, then as American president. And it was interesting for me to see that in our pollings, we could see an increasing support that people were asking their own governments, people of free countries from the European Union or the larger Europe, countries on the way to democracy. They were demanding that their governments will start to work more closely with the Chinese government, because they saw that this is a trend they have to follow. They saw that there will be economic profit out of it. We knew that this is not coming out of blue, that a worker in a factory somewhere in Romania will suddenly think that it's very strategic for my government to work with China because this will bring economic to my. We did not have enough of means. I mean, we as a West, and we did not invest enough of energy to look into the technologies and techniques how China is gaining our populations on its side. And they were techniques through media, through work with local and regional authorities. We have realized that articles talking about Chinese investments, which often never happened, were flooding local media, where exactly these people could read and could see that, okay, China probably should be the priority #1 for my own government. I read recently an article which was disclosing, it was during the COVID, when practically the Western world started to wake up, and we could see that our compliance to a certain extent with the Chinese regime, because of the economic cooperation, is backlashing and undermining our own society and democracy, especially during the pandemics. We have many examples of this complicity of the West with the Chinese regime, and I will mention two, which in the media, where the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, apparently with Chinese academics, have developed the facial recognition surveillance, which was then later used in Xinjiang in China to survive of people and practically undermine people's dignity and help the regime to suppress its own people. Yale University has sent the DNA samples to the Chinese Ministry of Public Security and has helped to develop a system which is now part of the genetic surveillance techniques. I'm using these examples because we slowly have realized during the pandemics, which was practically too late, that we are not only endangered by the regime in China, but to a certain extent, we are also complicit of the regime, because we for too long believed that economic engagement with China will bring democracy and support human rights in China. Unfortunately, and coming from originally from an organization supporting democracy, we have learned a lesson already some time ago that economic engagement not necessarily supports democratization of a country. We have learned this lesson in Russia. Now we are learning hard lesson with China. I will maybe use a couple of examples from the EU. Again, a lesson learned, where the EU has EU Stratcom was ready to publish a report, EU versus Disinfo, which was trying to cover how China was trying to influence our own population through disinformation during the pandemic. We have evidence, and it was revealed that China or some complicits with China, proxies, were trying to influence and have managed to influence this report. We all probably know about that EU diplomats, all EU or ambassadors of all EU member states were writing a letter to the Chinese people during the pandemics, and this letter was self-censored by the ambassador of EU to China, Mr. Choucri. We also know, and it was brought by media, that EU diplomats who are in charge of leading the negotiations with China about the future EU trade deal with China and the investment deal do not have the issues related to human rights and Hong Kong in their minutes and in their agenda to bring up with the Chinese representatives. This all shows that if we are not going to put our strengths together and stand against this regime, it's not only we are failing in our human and moral responsibility for the people in China or Hong Kong or other parts of the world who are suppressed by totalitarian regimes, but we are also failing to defend freedom and democracy in our own countries. And that's why I believe that we really, it is a turning point for the history of the West, because we shape the way how we engage with the rest of the world. There are positive signals. For example, the NGO from the UK, Hong Kong Watch, has managed to gather over 900 signatures from legislators all around the world to express their views or express their concerns or practically tell to the representatives of the regime of China after they started the work on the security law for Hong Kong that this will have consequences, that the Western world will have to react if China passes this law. We all know that the law was passed yesterday and came into power or came into law today. It's already being used in Hong Kong to suppress the people who deserve and fight for their own freedom, and as we see, or for their own lives in a certain way. We have established also IPAC, National Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. So I'm just using these examples as examples that there are things happening, that the West is realizing and is getting together in order to defend our own democracy, as I mentioned, and democracy and freedom of every person in this world, as we have the moral responsibility for it as economic powers and powers who have influence on the other countries and the rest of the world. The EU, in its own treaties, has an Article 21, which clearly stipulates that the EU must bring the values which brought the member states of the European Union together in its foreign policy. It is our moral obligation to talk about human rights when we are discussing trade deals with China. It's our moral obligation to our own citizens to defend our own businesses when China is stealing their intellectual property. Because if we are, as I said, if we are losing the superiority of democracy and democratic part of the world in this global world, the digital technologies and AI are going to be turned against our own people. And I will maybe finish with two thoughts, using thoughts of others and great people. Cardinal Bo from Myanmar, he has written a very, very powerful article about, where he was practically analyzing how we as the West have failed to defend the world from the pandemics. And he clearly said that the CCP's repression, lies, and corruption are responsible for these global pandemics and for the death and suffering of so many people. We know that it's not only the health which was put in danger or the people who have passed away, but it's also the economic crisis which now follows after the pandemics. But my question is, to what extent we were complicit with this repression, lies, and corruption of the CCP? The CCP will not be able to be corrupted by itself if we were not part of the corruption, or our businesses, our diplomats, our politicians were not part of the corruption scenes. And I think this is exactly where we need to put our emphasis on, is the moral responsibility. We have to strengthen our own democratic systems to be able to remain superior and defend the freedom of people in our countries, in the West, but also in the rest of the world. And I will conclude because when I was thinking what is actually our mission now, I started to think about the words of Churchill at the beginning of the Second World War, when the UK started to kind of join the forces, and he didn't promise people victory. Didn't promise because we are or superior, we are going to win this war. He promised people tears, blood, and sweat. And I am afraid this is exactly what we have to tell our population, our people. And it's very difficult, especially for political leaders as me, to tell people that we have a huge fight ahead of us, and we are not going to win this fight without sacrifices. We have to sacrifice maybe certain economic profits or economic profit in order to win this fight, in order to be able to defend that development, our brains, technologies, AI will serve our people and will continue serving our people and their dignity. Very much.
Thanks, Miriam. Thank you. Joe, I'm kind of troubled by all of this because it sounds to me like we're heading into another Cold War. And as somebody who spent most of his adult life in the middle of that Cold War, that's a troubling thought. You're particularly well known for dealing with this kind of conflict. How are we going to deal with it?
Well, thanks, Mike. I was asked to talk a little bit about what kind of a new order there will be after the COVID pandemic ends, if it ever ends. And that will, in that comment, I will address the specific question that you asked.
Great, thanks.
I think the most important thing, though, is we try to speculate about a new order after COVID is to start with humility, in the sense that there's just an awful lot we don't know about this current crisis. We're at an early stage. You might call it like watching Act 1 of a 5-act play. And we don't know how Act 5 is going to turn out. For example, we don't know as much as we thought about the virus itself, the ways of transmission, and where everybody was focusing on contact early on. We also thought that it might be seasonal, that with heat and humidity it might decline the way flu declines, but in fact what we're seeing is a huge increase in the hottest and most humid parts of the United States, 80% in the last 2 weeks in the United States. So there's a lot we don't know about the virus. The other thing we don't know much about is how bad this economic recession is going to be. It's certainly not going to be a V-shaped recovery, though I'll leave that to the second panel. But whether it's a U and a short U or whether it's a long L, we don't know the answer to that either. So that's why I suggest that any predictions about the order after COVID have to be combined with that humility and caveats. The other thing I might point out is that we sometimes assume that when there are big events or big causes have big effects. Not always true. Sometimes little causes have big effects, and some big causes don't have big effects as you might expect. And for that, let me take you back to the 1918 influenza epidemic, which was huge. It was much larger than the current COVID pandemic is in terms of its lethality as we know it so far. The influenza epidemic killed more people than World War I did. And yet, when the historians and sociologists look at the 1920s, they don't see a big effect of the influenza epidemic. You do see some effects, but not the geopolitical earth-shaking changes that one might predict from such a huge lethal event. Now, some people say that's because it was masked by World War I. Others say it was before the age of social media, so we can't generalize from that. But I do think it reminds us to be cautious in assuming that big events are big causes, which therefore have big effects. That leads me to this question that many people have speculated about. Is this coronavirus going to be the point which tips world politics, where China replaces the United States and overtakes the United States? That this is the going to be the turning point. I suspect this is overdone. I don't see that as likely. I think if you look at three types of power: military, economic, and soft power. In military power, the United States is more than 3 times larger as measured by budgets than China. In economic power, China is measured at exchange rates about 2/3 the size of the American economy. Sometimes people say China has passed the U.S. using a measure called purchasing power parity, but that's really a measure of welfare. When you're measuring power, you don't import oil or jet engines at purchasing power parity. You use them at exchange rates. And by that measure, China is 2/3 the size of the U.S. And when you look at soft power, while China has been placing enormous resources into trying to increase its soft power, it hasn't had a very good return on investment. Public opinion polls show a great deal of suspicion of China in most areas, except for Africa. There's some countries in Africa and some in Latin America. But by and large, if you take the Soft Power 30 Index, which is published in London every year, which looks at the top 30 countries in terms of their soft power, China comes out number 27 or 28, and the U.S. is usually in the top 4 or 5. When you have that degree of disparity in power on all 3 dimensions, the argument that somehow this coronavirus is going to overcome that in a short time, not very likely. These larger conditions in terms of power politics are more resilient. They take longer to change than that people realize. What that means is that we don't have to be hysterical about China. China, I agree with what Miriam said. China is a challenge. There are problems that we have to face up to with China. But the idea that somehow it's about to pass us or to swallow us, that we can't cope with it, I think that the danger there is we overreact. And if we create a new Cold War as a result of our hysteria, the net effect of that will be that we're unable to cooperate up with China on areas where we do have to cooperate. And the pandemic is a perfect example of that. And climate change is another one. So the ability to have a cooperative rivalry, we both cooperate and compete simultaneously, is going to be the secret to success. Now, what have we learned from the performance so far of our two countries after the onset of the coronavirus pandemic? I think you can make it that both countries failed. The initial response by Xi Jinping and by Donald Trump was denial, which led to delay, which cost lives. And that was replaced then by blame shifting. And that was then replaced by propaganda, which basically tried to change the narrative of its initial failure by what's sometimes called mask diplomacy, providing medical equipment and masks and so forth. But if you look at the public opinion polls, you'll find that it hasn't been that successful, that people suspect China's motives, and it hasn't repaired that loss of soft power. And of course, on the American side, Trump has tried to blame China for it all, or the World Health Organization, and that essentially has just diminished American soft power. So I can think you could argue that both of these two countries, the two largest economies in the world, two largest national economies, have failed this test, which is rather ironic, because people used to say during the Cold War that the only thing that would bring the United States and the Soviet Union together would be the threat from an alien creature from Mars. Well, we've had the equivalent of an alien creature, a virus, which doesn't care at all about the nationalities of the humans it kills, and yet we fail to respond in any other than nationalist and tribal ways. People say, well, yes, but you're just utopian. After all, I just wrote a book called Do Morals Matter, with a question mark in the title. So what would you expect from somebody like that? I would submit that there was an alternative to how we could deal this, and it still may be an alternative. What I describe in Do Morals Matter is the origins of something like the Marshall Plan, where it's not whether you define your national interest and whether you protect your national interest, it's how broad. The United States is willing to give away 2% of its gross domestic product to help Europe recover after World War II. And that was good for us and good for the European. So in that sense, the moral issue is not whether you protect the national interest, it's whether you define the national interest broadly enough so that what's good for you is good for others as well. And that's, I think, where we failed in this current crisis. Imagine, for example, that Trump and Xi Jinping, instead of getting into this propaganda warfare, had said, let's get the group of 20 to set up a special fund to ensure that there are vaccines available for poor countries, so that essentially there isn't a reservoir of coronavirus in the southern half of the globe, which will come back and hurt us on second and third wave. After all, in 1918, the second and third waves of the influenza epidemic killed more people than the first wave. So you can make an argument out of self-interest. We ought to set aside funds for a special provision of vaccine, particularly to the health sectors of poor countries, before we use it all up on ourselves. That would essentially be a little bit like what Jean Monnet did after World War II, when he proposed the European Coal and Steel Committee. Germany had invaded France 3 times in 70 years. The natural inclination after in 1945 was, well, hold Germany down, take away the Ruhr or the Saarland from them, don't let them restore their strength. Instead, Monet said, if we do that, we're just going to repeat history. Suppose we take a new approach and join with Germany and Italy and form a European coal and steel community, which became known as the Schuman Plan and eventually became the European Economic Community and the European Union. That was transformational leadership, which made a huge difference to history. You can't imagine Germany and France going to war today. It was possible, I would submit, that China and the U.S. could have done something like that in regard to a special fund for poor countries. It's still possible, I would submit, that if you have a change in government in Washington, I don't imagine it for this administration, but if you had a change in government, you could imagine setting up a special fund in which we would say, if we invent the vaccine first, or if we have a vaccine that works, we will set aside 10% of it for helping the health sectors in poor countries before we say we'll use 100% of it on ourselves before we sell it to others. That might be an interesting initiative for the Biden administration, if there is one, to take. It would enormously restore American soft power, but it would be an example, as I said in Do Morals Matter, of defining the national interest in a way which is good for us, but good for others at the same time. So that would be my specific recommendation of what I think we can do in this current situation, which I think would have a transformative effect on the order that will follow the pandemic crisis. Not what we see so far in Act 1 of the 5-Act Pay is that we're seeing a decline in economic globalization that was already underway, but I think it will be increased by the effects of the pandemic. But the one thing I think we're not seeing that many people predicted, which is the authoritarian model proving more powerful than the democratic model. That was the conventional wisdom at the beginning of the pandemic. But it's interesting to see that the countries some of the countries have done worst are democracies. Some of the ones that have done worst are autocracies. And some of the ones that have done best are democracies. Look at New Zealand or South Korea or Germany. It may be that it's not the question of democracy or autocracy as much as the idea that populist nationalist leadership, the macho bravado of the type you see in Trump or you see in Bolsonaro and so forth, those are the types of leadership that have failed, not democracies as such. Or maybe to go back to an issue that that we've thought about before, maybe having more women leaders would help. But in any case, it's early in the stage of this crisis to know the outcome. I don't expect it to reverse the relative positions of the U.S. and China. I don't think it means that autocracies have done better than democracies. And I do think there is a prospect for transformative leadership to take an initiative along the lines I described, with making sure the vaccines are available to poor countries out of humanitarian interests and out of our self-interest. So let me stop there.
Thanks, Joe, very much. Tuan,
Yep, Zan joined already.
say again?
Yep, Jan, Duncan Smith joined already. Governor, yes.
Where is he?
Yes, that is the, I would like to let you know that is the Jan Duncan Smith from UK joined already.
I'm sorry, having a little difficulty understanding, but are we going to go now to our panelists, or are we waiting for Duncan Smith.
But I think Tuan said Duncan Smith is available now. Yeah.
Do we have him? Where is he?
Yes.
Duncan Smith.
You have to unmute your microphone.
Okay. Talk to us.
I'm afraid we had a major emergency statement here in the House of Commons on the China's actions over Hong Kong. And this is the dominant feature of what I'm on at the moment. I set up a little while ago with some others an organization called the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, IPAC, which has now got 16 nations, 2 co-chairs in each from left and right, all parliamentarians coming together with the single feature of concern with regards to the behavior of China across a range of issues, and what should democracies in the free world do to deal with this. And the purpose of IPAC is to argue for those democracies to come together and to shape a common position with regards to the China under this existing communist government. There is, Hong Kong is just but the last element in a whole series of abuses with regards to the natural order, the rules-based order that we exist under, certainly in the free world. There's a chain of them now. That what's happened in Hong Kong is essentially the Chinese government saying that they don't really care what the rest of the world thinks of them, and that their ideological position is that their form of government is the form of government that will ultimately prevail against what they think and see, I think, as a weak free world bunch of nations who don't seem to be able to ever share a common purpose, but are desperate for business from China, and so quietly turn a blind eye to most of these abuses. On Monday, the IPAC organization, which I spoke of, produced a report which was Professor Zen's report on the Uyghurs and the treatment of the Uyghurs using Chinese government documents, in which it's demonstrated quite clearly that a systematic process, really, I think, verging on the elimination of an ethnic group, which the papers talked about with regards to sterilization of Uyghur women. You can see the birth rates have collapsed for Uyghurs in the last 2 years under this particular policy. This is just but one, the treatment of the Christians, treatment of the Tibetans. You can look at the behavior over the South China Seas, their aggressive behavior now on the border with India, their military posturing over Taiwan, and their stated strategic aim of having the most significant global economy and the most significant global military power by 2040, thus to be able to assert their rights as they see them over Taiwan. So all of this, then if you go to the strategic nature of the way in which they have bit by bit pieced together a dominance in the commercial world, not just in terms of telecoms and the big debates here and elsewhere on whether Huawei should be involved in the telecom system, which I don't think they should be. And bear in mind, 10, 12 years ago, there were at least 10 or 11 systems companies in the telecoms area that could have produced systems and networks. They're now down to three in the free world: Samsung, Nokia, and Ericsson. There are none in America. They all went out of business. Why? Because Huawei, in breach of the WTO, the 85% ownership of the rare earth materials that go for the making up of batteries and telephones. They're now predominance in battery technology, knowing full well that the free world is going to be desperate now to move to zero carbon, and therefore this councils in the UK. You can go through, and the reason why I agreed to come onto this, and I'm speaking on it others, is I think, frankly, the free world now needs to see this for what it is, which is a piecemeal process of domination, which we simply cannot accept. Hong Kong, as I say, is the last of the most recent links in this chain and process. They've given up the idea of diplomacy as a tool, which was the case 8 years ago or 7 years ago. And President Xi is now bound on a course of much greater confrontation and aggression on the basis that their economy will continue to grow and they will have the wherewithal. But of course, that lies in our hands, and it's up for the free world to decide whether they're prepared to allow that economy to grow in quite the same stage unless they change their ways. And I think, therefore, as I said in the House of Commons today, it's all well and good to talk about Magnitsky arrangements on individuals and sanctions, and it's all very well to speak of UN rapporteurs, which are all fine and very worthy, or even motions in the UN with regards to China's recent actions. But the only one area that I think they concern about is the nature of what happens to their economy if it doesn't continue to grow and grow at significant rates. The Chinese government relies on the people of China to acquiesce in this process, because, of course, each year they will be better off than the year before, and by some significant degree. So it does lie within the hands of the West to say to China, we can't go on allowing a country to access all that benefits it within the free world, particularly within the free market, but to ignore the rules that exist around the applications of those markets, to ignore the concept of human rights, which underpins the operation of those markets, and to consider that democracy can be swept aside in the strategic vision, and democracy and the rule of law underpin absolutely everything with regards to market interaction and countries' interaction with each other, without which we will end up, as we did in the 1930s, with enormous sanctions and barriers and trade freezing and real depressions. And I finally end by saying the honest truth is we've been here before. History has a habit of revisiting itself. We are now, I believe, at a similar place we were in the 1930s, which, to understand, you can choose to go on appeasing a nation, or you can choose to find a way to bring them step by step back into the rules-based order. We face that choice right now. I think Hong Kong was the moment when, if we didn't get it, we certainly have got to get it now.
Okay, thank you. Time for discussion, and I'm sure you've got lots of thoughts about this. And Joe, I want to go back to you briefly and get some response from you to what we've just heard. I mean, how do you suggest that we deal with this?
Well, I agree with what Ian Duncan Smith said about the problem that China poses and some of their aspirations. For example, I think the idea that we should allow Huawei to build our 5G telecommunications is absolutely crazy. And I hope that for security reasons, and I hope that eventually Boris Johnson will come around to the same point of view for Britain. So there are places, I mean, after all, China doesn't allow Google or Facebook to work on China for security reasons. The argument that we should allow them to do whatever they want inside our own country is a non sequitur. And I think that Miriam, in her comments earlier, made a similar point about China's use of what's sometimes called sharp power, information warfare in democratic countries. The Australians are reacting very strongly against this right now. So on that, we agree. I think if there's a difference, it would be I'm more confident in the assets that we have in the West. I think we actually can manage the problem that China poses. If you look at some of the advantages we have in geography, in energy, in demography, China's labor force is gold, dollar, finances we have, so forth. I think we're well ahead of China. What worries me is that if we get too scared about China, we react. A sensible strategy shouldn't either overestimate or underestimate China. And I think what's happening in Washington, is all the conventional wisdom is, China's 10 feet tall and they're about to sweep us away. That's the way to develop a strategy. I once was, to summarize this, I once was talking to Tuan. He and I were aboard of a company together, and we were having lunch, and I said, "Do you think China's going to pass the United States?" He said, "No." And I said, "Well, that's interesting. Why?" You said they can draw on the talents of 1.3 billion people, but you can draw on the talents of 7 billion people. And what's more, you can recombine them in diversity in a way which leads to much greater creativity than you get from ethnic Han nationalism. This, of course, spoken by an ethnic Han. And I think the danger I see is that if we overreact, if we cut back on immigration, which is helpful to us, if we cut back on our alliances or undercut our alliances, such as the crucial alliance with Japan, which anchors the Pacific, then we will essentially give China the capacity to basically compete with us. If we play our cards, I think we have the capacity to put in place restrictions and deterrent when China acts in ways that are unacceptable. But at the same time, we'll keep the capacity to deal with China on things like the current pandemic or on issues like climate change, which are very real and a very real threat. So, to my mind, I don't disagree with the measures that have been proposed. I just want to make sure that there's a sense of balance that you need for a successful strategy.
Thanks, Joe. Okay, who would like to begin to join the discussion?
Marc Rotenberg. Governor.
Yeah.
Marc Rotenberg. Yes.
Can we begin with Marc?
Yes.
Okay.
Marc, where are you? There you are.
I'm
Okay.
here. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to use a presentation. Get this to work. Let's see. Can you see this?
Yeah. Well.
Okay, very good. So I spoke with you in December of 2019 and provided an update on recent developments in artificial intelligence and the significance for democratic governance. So what I'll do this morning in a few minutes is to quickly recap what we previously discussed, talk about recent developments with face surveillance, and also how the response to COVID has emerged as a new test for democracies. You may recall that we had described a successful policy framework for the regulation of artificial intelligence that had been adopted by the OECD member countries in May of 2019. That framework was subsequently adopted by the G20 countries meeting in Japan in June. It sets out policies and principles to promote democratic values and safeguard human rights, encourage innovation and transparency. But there was also a sense among many civil society groups, academics, privacy officials, that the OECD policy framework did not go far enough in addressing some of the specific challenges arising in China. The social scoring of individual citizens, the use of AI techniques for mass surveillance. And so in an effort to create a stronger policy framework to address those challenges, a group of us put together the Universal Guidelines for Artificial Intelligence. And this photograph is actually a conference we held in Brussels in October 2018 with Tuan and European privacy officials and experts and NGOs to set out support for this more robust policy framework, which, as I said, is the Universal Guidelines for AI. This is intended to complement the OECD principles, to address specific challenges on which the OECD countries were silent on. For example, you will see in our list of 12 key principles at number 10, there's a prohibition on secret profiling We simply don't believe governments should engage in any type of secret scoring of individuals, and also what we refer to as unitary scoring, which is a specific response to the social credit score in China. Again, this set of principles provides a checklist, a way to evaluate policies and practices in the private sector as well as government frameworks. As we were talking about the adoption of these AI principles, we were recognizing simultaneously that one of the most critical challenges is the application of AI for face recognition. This is now broadly in place across China. It is one of the key techniques to maintain control over the Uyghurs. It has been a flashpoint during the protests in Hong Kong, with protesters purposefully wearing masks to avoid identification by the camera surveillance system that is widely dispersed across the city. In addition to our work in support of the AI policy frameworks, we have also urged an international moratorium on the use of facial recognition technology for mass surveillance. Here I am actually speaking last year to the privacy commissioners about the need to move forward on this. And we have good the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. In January of this year, Cambridge became the first major city on the East Coast to ban face surveillance. And Cambridge was followed last week by Boston. Boston has now banned the use of facial recognition. And again, if we think about this particular application of AI or the opposition to the application as an indicator of the health of a democratic government, I think we see a fairly stark contrast between recent developments in China, where the technology is used without restriction, and the response in robust democratic jurisdictions within the United States, where local rules have put in place effectively prohibitions. But still, looking ahead, it is clear that the challenge of COVID is going to bring greater pressure to the use of surveillance techniques. And we see Reuters, for example, just last month on the expansion of China's tracking techniques, specifically in response to the coronavirus. And so I'd like to propose that as we think about how countries are responding to the challenge of COVID, this will become a key test, the ability to maintain fundamental rights and to ensure transparency and accountability. Even judicial independence may become an issue if strong authoritarian governments seek greater controls. I've actually recently published an article about derogations from the Council of Europe Convention during a time of national emergency. I wrote the article before COVID, but some of what is in that article feels relevant to the current debate. I wanted to point you now quickly to a couple of very good resources as you may be thinking about policy responses to COVID that safeguard fundamental rights. The OECD continues to do very good work generally on economic development and tracking the impact of the coronavirus, but also trying to understand the impact specifically on data protection and other fundamental rights. And I've excerpted here a few of the key findings from a recent OECD report, and I would recommend that you visit their website for other related information. The other very good source of information on battling the pandemic and safeguarding fundamental rights, most remarkably, is coming from the World Health Organization. And in particular, Dr. Michael Ryan, who participates in the briefings with Dr. Tedros, has been very emphatic about the need to protect privacy and other fundamental rights, even as countries address the challenges of the pandemic. And again, I would encourage you to go online and look for some of the remarks of Dr. Ryan. He's been as outspoken in support of human rights as any advocate I've ever known. Finally, I just wanted to end with a brief note, a short item I published in December in the New York Times actually picks up on some of the themes from Miriam and Joe and Iain Smith from the earlier panel. We have been looking more closely at the growing impact of Chinese surveillance technologies for Americans. It's not, of course, simply about facial recognition. It includes also the 5G network. It includes drones, interestingly. The top manufacturer of commercial drones in the world is DJT, which is a Chinese firm. And there is widespread concern that the video surveillance that is enabled by those commercial drones actually, in effect, phone home, sending a video feed back to the manufacturer in China. The concern is so widespread that last year the Department of Interior grounded the fleet of drones from DJT. So I think there are a wide range of issues. The Democratic government to develop new techniques to assess the impact and measure how that's safe.
Your voice.
I'll stop here.
I missed that last few sentences. The rest of you get them? Because I lost the sound. No.
Yeah.
Marc, let me ask you one question. Have you been able to make contact with the Chinese government or representatives of the Chinese government? Are you talking to them at all, or have you tried to unsuccessfully? Give us a sense of what you'd like to see happen in terms of that link.
We've had no direct contact with the Chinese government. I am in contact with Chinese academics working in the AI field, and also with the dean of a very well-known school of journalism in China. But most of our work over the last couple of years has been to essentially document what we see as a challenge, rise in use of AI, and try to strengthen policy frameworks. So that's been our effort today.
Okay.
Governor, I think President Rebecca, she have very good connection with China government.
Madam President.
Yes.
Welcome.
Please, President, please stop.
Do you hear me? Or am I still mute? I'm mute. Can you unmute me?
Yes, I hear you, but a little bit.
You hear me, do you? There's a background noise. Something is very wrong. I'm getting a whistle here. Something is wrong with the sound system.
Yes.
What on earth is that? Here.
Yes, we hear already. Good.
Okay.
Oh, we don't hear you. We don't hear you. Yeah.
Mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Is there an echo in your?
Yes. So, okay.
I don't know where the echo is coming from. There's something wrong with the sound system.
The problem is that she will have somebody else who's linked in standing near her. That's why you're getting feedback, because the two systems are cycling. So they need to make sure whoever is near her is away and out of the room or shuts their communications device down.
So I seem to be getting interference here. Are you? Are you hearing me? Here. Inre kaupungssauda dator man just. Ska jag ett inre rapport måste jag dator. Can you delay for get somebody else to speak, and we'll try and see what is wrong at our end, shall we? Tuan, get somebody else to speak, and we will check if who is using another computer here nearby.
Yeah, okay.
President,
President, we'll talk later. And I
yes.
think,
Yes.
Governor,
Yes.
please invite, I think maybe next, that is Nazli.
Who we inviting here?
Nazli.
Nazli?
Yes, Nazli.
Nazli, there you are. Speak to us. We can't hear you.
Okay. Very interesting discussion. My sense, just looking at data without much interpretation, we may be underestimating the extent of Chinese global penetration. And I'm just thinking about one item that has not been brought up so far, which is the participation of China in undersea cable networks. And not singly, but as part of consortia or part of larger groups. And we've been tracking that along with the connection to the Belt and Road, but more important, in connection to China's own control of its access to itself. What's going to be very interesting to see what happens as China increases its control over Hong Kong, if it does, and what impact this will have on the undersea communication networks that most of us ignore. But please remember that well over 95% of all internet communication goes through undersea networks. It's submerged, and there's a whole political ecology and a political economy underneath that. This is to say that this is one dimension that we've underestimated, and I'm wondering whether there may be others with respect to China's very effective strategy of economic expansion, and I would say lateral pressure in this context. That's about all I'd like to say at the moment. That's it.
That's it?
That's it. For now.
Any contact with the Chinese government as you do your work? Talking to any representatives of the Chinese government?
I'm sorry, you talking to me?
Yeah.
To the group?
Any effort to make contact with the Chinese government, representatives of the Chinese government, to discuss this with?
I'm sorry, Mike, I don't understand.
You have contact with the China government?
Me? No. My group? No. My department? No. Others? I don't know.
But Governor, that President Vietor have very good connection. She have some time meeting with Xi Jinping when she was the president of World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid. World Leadership Alliance Club de Madrid, very deep relation with China, understand about China, and Xi Jinping welcome and have a meeting with President Vietor already sometimes. So I think when President from Latvia President talk, she can say and she can help us very much.
Madam President?
I would just like to add that, as I said, I've just looked at the data. I've just interpreted the traces, the evidence, not the diplomacy of it, although the diplomacy must be addressed, of course.
Great. Okay, Madam President, tell us about your work with representatives of the Chinese government.
I don't know what's happening.
Oh, okay, I think you can try to talk, because maybe that we try to listen to you even with echo. No, I think we try to listen. Yeah.
I get an echo. No, do go ahead. I will come in as soon as we manage to fix this. I don't know what's going on. Well, to open microphones in proximity. Okay, can you go
So
ahead?
I think, Governor, we can invite by Mr. Peru. Beatriz, ladies.
So Tuan, if she turns off of her microphone, her speaker, and has only her microphone on, it'll work fine.
We have a child in the house who plays with computers, so I don't know if my husband is going to go and check. So far, I get an echo, do I? Yeah. We're looking for the cause. Please go ahead with other speakers.
Okay, Tuan?
Yep, I think I should
be
be by Mr. Peru.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you. Oh, I think there's a noise. Sorry about that. No, nobody here, no child, but anyway, I'm just going to be brief. I'll start by saying that as I was listening to all of you, here's a country, Peru, where China is the #1 investor in almost every aspect of our economy. Is the #1 investor in mining. You know, this is mostly a mining country. It's #1 in fishing, #2 in the area to Chile, and it's #1 in oil, carbon as well. So, and you name it, it's going on and on and on, and so there you have a practical case for things that I've been listening you're discussing. Now, maybe because today I'm involved with the university, I preside over a private university here. I was thinking that regarding the democracy issue, my concern is that at least in this part of the world, more and more millennials are disengaged with the concept of democracy. They really do not think that it's that important, and I think that was talking about 1968 and what it meant, and I think that it meant at the time maybe that universities thought that students were too political, and then they moved in a backlash, and now I think we're seeing maybe the effects of that, and I think we should work more carefully and thoroughly into building the concept and the benefits of democracy to our students, you know, and this is something that worries me a lot. And then thirdly, in the aspect of pandemia and liberties or freedom, we have suffered a lot. The model that was chosen here to fight against pandemia, unfortunately, hasn't worked. I think it was chosen like an authoritarian kind of model, which a complete lockdown, complete quarantine. I haven't been able to get out of my house for the last 110 days, literally. Well, just once to the dentist and once to the ophthalmologist because I had to. But it was like going to the moon. And so, nevertheless, the results have not been good. We are today the 6th worst country in the world in terms of the contagion, and we are the I must just say that we're having the largest drop in GDP in this year in Latin America. So it's been very unfortunate, but the model didn't work. And the quarantine ended yesterday. I don't know what's going to happen in the next forthcoming week, and I hope it doesn't create a growth spike. But I am. I can see how everything that you discussed there has been moving along in terms of very practical moves of China in entering an economy that is rich in commodities, like, you know, oil and mining and fishing, and today they're the key players in this country. So I just leave it at that, and maybe we can listen to the president. Yeah, okay.
Interesting. Interesting. Who's next? Tuan, who's next?
Yes, President.
Am I on? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yay!
Good, very good voice, President.
Yes.
Yes. Please.
All right. I can't see you, but I will go on and with what I have to say. Thank you very much for inviting me to this interesting discussion. I'd like to just make really 2 points in terms of the general title of this conference, which is on the one hand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and on the other hand, and you could say that there are two aspects to it. One is man against nature, if you like, completely independent of the kind of governance that one has. And the other one is the relationship of the individual to their society, or more concretely, to those who are in power to take decisions concerning the collectivity and the collective behavior of, in this case, nation states. First, about the man versus nature aspect. We have been concentrating for a number of years now on climate change as being the greatest danger to humanity, and to some extent the Boston Global Forum has also been engaging in a very significant debate about the effects of artificial intelligence on society. The pandemic is something that has never been at the center of worldwide discussion until the COVID-19 incident. And it's a very strange thing when you think of it, how the whole thing happened. It's supposed to be a microscopic particle that isn't even alive. It certainly doesn't seem to be possessed of anything resembling a new nervous system, a consciousness, a mind, or intentionality. Nevertheless, it seems fantastically adapted to attacking humanity, not just in terms of very clever ways of spreading the contagion, but also in terms of being lethal. And strangely enough, by the way, weeding out of the population those who are poor, as we saw in the case of New York State, the poor and the aged in Spain, notably. The reaction of governments to it, frankly, I do not see a bilateral division between totalitarian, authoritarian, and democratic governments. It seems to me that the first reaction was in terms of finding out what on earth is happening, what kind of pathogen it is, what its behavior is like, and what the implications are for collective health and security. And in that sense, even with an initial phase of denial, Dr. Lee, instead of being congratulated, being called to the police station and being reprimanded for spreading disinformation and then losing his life in the end, the Chinese did sequence the virus. They did put it out in the public domain. They did notify the World Health Organization. Whether they influenced the World Health Organization in undue ways remains to be investigated, but certainly President Trump's precipitate decision to withdraw funding from the only worldwide body that is able to handle a health pandemic, to choose that moment of need for major and maximum mobilization across the world, to choose to withdraw from it seems to me, I think it surprised many people in the world in terms of a kind of expected reaction. But the first reaction of governments, let's say both the US and the Chinese examples, the first reaction was to try and deny it because politicians don't like bad news. Politicians get happily supported or re-elected, as the case may be, if there's good news to be had, and they can say, look, under Marc. We heard this from a number of more or less successful politicians. I mean, President Bolsonaro in Brazil, I'm not sure that to this very day, he's not trying to minimize the power of this particular pathogen to truly influence the safety of the citizens of his country. He doesn't seem to be a man who listens to scientists or to scientific evidence. And I'm not, it'd be worth looking into to see how he continues to react to this situation. But what has arisen in this situation is there, in terms of democratic structures of governments and the participation of citizens and the rights of citizens, what we have had is an emergency that has allowed even democratic governments to take measures that inhibit or in fact having to react to the pandemic. And in ways, by the way, I have not seen the mathematical among populations and factually determining the level of risk to public health as opposed to risk to public economic viability of populations, the risk of availability of food and so on and so forth. The availability of hospitals for other diseases than COVID, because they have not gone away. People still have cancers and they have heart attacks, and hospitals have to be able to look after them and not just COVID-19 patients. But what is worrisome about this particular pandemic is that even in democracies, what we have seen is that the population has been submitted to infringements of their basic civil rights, which they have voluntarily accepted to be the downside, if you like, the counterpart of their increased, not just their personal security, in other words, lowering their own risk of getting infected, but also civic responsibility towards their fellow citizens in terms, if I, even without symptoms, being asymptomatic, I go out in society, or as my husband and I were planning to have our 60th wedding anniversary on the 16th of July, is it responsible on our part to gather people together with the risk of contagion? This is the sort of thing that one has to weigh. And I have seen on the internet, for instance, on YouTube in South America from Argentina, there's a lady who broadcasts every day a denial of the existence of a pandemic. She claims that it's all a conspiracy to oppress the people in Argentina, which I cannot pronounce myself on the level of democracy in Argentina. And she may well have reasons to doubt the goodwill of the government of her country. But nevertheless, you see, here is somebody going on, speaking in Spanish, which is spoken by a great many millions of people, and saying this is all an imaginary conspiracy. Is there such a thing as this pathogen? Are there such things as deaths actually happening? This is all a conspiracy to infringe on your freedoms. Look at the Declaration of Human Rights, the right of movement, the right of contacting other people, etc., etc. Then the other thing is, if you compare the rates of mortality in different countries, then of course you realize that it's not just a matter of how democratic they are as opposed to how autocratic, but it is really a matter how much have they invested in public health as one of their priorities as against their economic might worldwide or their military might worldwide, as certainly is the case of the United States. As Professor Nye pointed out, their primacy is at the moment unquestioned. The United States does not have real rivals at this moment in terms of its economic and its military might, but in terms of its public health policy and the safety of its citizens, particularly those of color or of poor economic backgrounds. Frankly, I think that your country, you who are in America, I think it has something to think about. And when the population goes out on the streets because of a black man being killed by the police, it's interesting, they did not go out in the streets when the statistics appeared showing that the rate of deaths in New York State was disproportionately among people of color as opposed to white people. They did not go out in the streets and demonstrate. But then when there was a video showing graphically how a policeman choked to death an unarmed civilian who was only a suspect, then people go out in the streets and they forget about the risks of contagion and so on. So that even in countries that are technically democracies, I think that real democracy and real equitable conditions and chances for citizens, that is the challenge that democracies worldwide should be facing. And it's their rate of success in that, in how well they answer to the needs of their citizens, that is going to determine in the end whether authoritarian or free countries are going to win out, if you like, in the race to power and supremacy. We have to be better. That is the only way to win.
Wonderful.
Madam President, let me ask again, though. Are you in regular contact with representatives of the Chinese government on this?
I have, as president, as past president by now of the World Leadership Alliance, and also as co-chair of Nizami Ganjavi International Center last year, as head of both bodies, we had a group meeting, an audience with President Xi Jinping. But the 2 years before that, he received representatives of the World Leadership Alliance from as broad a spectrum of continents as we could have, and we engaged in a dialogue with him. And my colleagues had serious debates about the wisdom or the desirability of engaging with the government, which explicitly is not a democratic one. It's a one-party rule, and we know exactly how it's structured. Nevertheless, just as I was one of the people who engaged with my native country, with people in my native country, Latvia, even as a child of exiles, I lived in Canada, a democratic country, and but I took contact with poets, with writers, with intellectuals in Latvia as much as possible during Soviet times. My personal conviction, and my colleagues at the Club de Madrid, we're 110 former heads of state or government, that engagement and some sort of dialogue, at least on those topics on which agreement can be reached, is a beginning. And you know, the Chinese themselves have this concept of a drop of water being stronger than stone, because drop by drop, you can water can destroy stone if there's repeated iteration of something. And I feel that we, from democratic countries with democratic convictions, we are like the drops of water that are trying to, in some way, reach out to people in countries where the stone is the rigid authoritarian system under which they're living. But hopefully, the very populations of these countries eventually will join that sort of approach of drop by drop, requiring greater freedoms for the individual, as opposed to the collectivity, as opposed to the state. And by the way, in the Western world, the fact that, say, the London police can follow every step that anybody who walks into London at one point can follow them everywhere. The fact that when you walk around with your mobile telephone for months on end, every step you take is being mapped out and traced and available in big data. This sort of facial recognition programs, which are being now used in a way that many find objectionable in China. But believe you me, it's just a matter of time before they are going to be used by anti-terrorists and other forces in the Western world, and that means you and I are going to be submitted to them as well. So we have things to be concerned about in the rights of the individual as opposed to the collectivity, about the rights to privacy, safe from drones overhead, which will not only spy on you, they can explosives on you, and they can kill you long distance. And these are concerns, I think, worldwide.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. It does seem to me, and I don't want to get into some great detail, we've got lots to do, but it does seem to me that if there are not continuing ongoing discussions with representatives of the Chinese government about the kinds of issues that concern us here, we're making a grave mistake. Now, we've got our own problems in this country and elsewhere with our political leadership, but not to have a continuing dialogue with the Chinese doesn't make an awful lot of sense to me. In any event, well, that's something that we'll, I hope, be able to explore in great detail as time goes on. Okay, Tuan, who's next?
I think now Japan. State Minister from Japan. He took from Japan now.
Okay.
Yep.
Is this Mr. Nakayama?
Yes, Nakayama.
Okay. Mr. Nakayama, you there?
Tom, please connect with Japan. Japan, not me, they connect already.
Nakayama? Okay. Okay. Talk to us.
He's just now, please.
Hello. I'm not Chinese, but I'm Japanese.
You look fine.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yep. You can hear
Yes,
you.
my
Yep.
name is Nakayama. Thank you. Thank you. I'm a future Japanese Prime Minister, and today I have a very good opportunity to speak to everyone in the world, and especially you are the leader of the world, and I hope like me, I'm this year I'm going to be 50 years old politician. I first elected 2003, and I think I am closest guy politician near China, and we have a lot of fear. And tonight I'd like to share lots of figure, especially like. Today I'd like to show you the actually now we are preparing for the map. Anyway, okay, so sorry. So okay. Can you see the photograph?
No.
共有じゃない。あ、ではないね。こちらで共有で、これ。OK、これ大丈夫。Can you see?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so, all right. Sorry, it's in Japanese. But you can see you can see the right side, on the right side, the graph.
Mm-hmm.
In 1991, the Chinese, they didn't have any nuclear submarine. But today, 2020, they have more than 52 nuclear submarines. And you can see the left side up. In English, they call the type 094. This submarine, nuclear submarine, is a Jing class submarine, and they have operated since 2007, and they carry a J-range missile. But today, this year, 2020, we have Olympic and Paralympics in Tokyo landed, but it's postponed for next year, to next year. But the Chinese PLA, they are preparing for the new missile, which has 12,000 kilometer range or 14,000 kilometer range new missile. And this is a map. you can see the red submarine inside of the South China Sea. If the Chinese submarine goes to South China Sea, and if they launch the newest missile of the Chinese Navy, they can already aim Washington, D.C., White House. So, which means that 2020 Chinese activity in Hong Kong, in around the Kashmir, planning lots of United States, I guess. And a few weeks ago, Mr. Pompeo and Yoketsuchi, I don't know how to call him in English, but Yang Jiechi, they met at the Honolulu, but they were not surfing. They were talking about the sharing the Pacific Ocean. The western side of the Pacific Ocean controlled by the Chinese PLA, and the east side of the Pacific Ocean controlled by the United States, the armed forces. And this strategy it's a little bit, I think we can feel the fear, because someday in the future, Chinese will invade not just Hong Kong, but also Taiwan, and after that, our country, Japan, will be under controlled by the Chinese PLA activity, at least area of their the training places, spot, air, sea, land, anywhere, even outer space. And they also made and established the new aircraft carrier. They bought Varyag from Ukraine, and they made new type 001 called the Shantung. Sounds like champagne, but they already made two of those aircraft carriers. And now I will show the South China Sea. What's going on South China Sea, near the Japan, near the Philippines, near the Vietnam, near the ASEAN countries? This is the very great nature, called the Johnson Reef. And 2014 January, this is a picture. But only 4 years later, they convert to the military base. You can see missile launch, and also the heliport. And this is a huge reef. 2010 February, you can see small hut in the ocean in the South China Sea. But 6 years later, you can see the base in a very, very clean and beautiful water. This is 2014 March. Small hut, going to be like a big base of Chinese PLA. 2014 March, small hut, it's become like this, the big base. This is the biggest reef called the Fiery Cross, 2014 August. And it now, they have a runway more than 3,000 meters, almost 4 kilometers. And you can see the radar under the center, the photograph. This radar is aiming the satellite of the armed forces of the United States in outer space. They try to jamming the wave to control any GPS on the ground. So they are jamming from this artificial island. And this is a Subi Reef, and 2015 February, 2017 July, they also made a new runway. This is also more than 3,000 meters. This is also Mischief Reef. They built as a base as usually. So, and also they are attacking all the cyber and also electric attacks they are shaping their techniques. And also we have a concern between Russia too. And as you can see, we have a northern territory issue between the Russian and Russia. They have a base in the northern territory, and the 3,500 troops is staying over there 247. And you can see the red line. This is a fiber cable in the Eurasian continent. And Russia made a new Huawei, collaborate with Huawei. The Rostelecom already made and fiber cables, as the president of Latvia already said. I'm really agree. I vote for Latvia president. But 2019 July, they already launched. They used this cable to do something, some cyber internet. They already run this company. Cable 2017. Russia and China around Japan, they are always collaborating, and also they are doing joint training between the two, and called Senkaku Island. They are trying to steal in Japan. Why? Because this island is 100% no, 1,000% no, 100,000% up. And oh, Yasu, you are wearing beauty request to please give it back to me. And the Chinese friend, no, this is not yours, this is mine. This is the Chinese way how to steal the island or territory. So we are really concerned. We are really concerned about what the Chinese now they are doing, not just Hong Kong, not just towards Taiwan, but also the democratic country called Japan. Also, we feel the fear of the Chinese communist playing and challenges. I was born in 1970, so I little bit experienced Cold War, and we are always democratic side. We are free country, but now we are the front line of the Chinese communist and also the Russian fear, and so I hope all the leaders of the
Okay, so I think he's finished already, so we can continue, Governor. Yeah, I think he present long already, enough already. So I think now we continue from Boston, and I think I would like to say some minutes about United Democracy Power. I think democracy now today is we think that we need to protect and strengthen. And from my view, I'm from non-democracy country. I'm from Vietnam, and exactly before came to the US, I don't.
Thank you, Tuan.
I don't think so much about democracy. So okay. So why?
負荷がそのコンピューターの能力に対して負荷が高いすぎて
No. Because Nakayama took more than 15 minutes already. Nakayama, you have to learn about technical. So we continue. So thank you so much for your talk, and we will connect with you. And if you need to present something more, send me, and we will send to our participants here. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
I love you. All of you. Thank you.
Break it and ask the same question I asked before. Are you and the Japanese government in touch with the Chinese on these issues? Are you discussing them?
The governor would like to discuss with you, Nakama. Governor would like to discuss with you. He would like to
ask you the same question I've asked others. Is the Japanese government having regular conversations and talks with the Chinese about these issues?
This is not the matter what the Chinese going to talk to us. Okay, so for example, if a Chinese submarine or Chinese Coast Guard, they came just in front of Honolulu or Pearl Harbor, are you going to talk with them? No. I think we wipe them out. And this is our territory, but today it's more than 70 days. They just stayed outside of our territorial water, territorial sea. And they are always aiming the radar towards us. And our Coast Guard is protecting our territorial water. And the one thing I have to tell you, Chinese government, they changed the law about Chinese Coast Guard really clearly. They used to be Chinese Coast Guard belong to the government, but not belong to the military. But this time they changed the law. Few days ago, like 2 days, 3 days ago, they changed the law, and now Chinese Coast Guard, it belongs to a Chinese military, ordered directly by the Xi Jinping. So they are preparing another stage. So Japanese government and the Japanese Congress side really worried about their activities and also the actions. Thank you.
But no ongoing discussions at this point with the Chinese government about it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I eat Japanese food, but lately I never eat the Chinese food now.
Yes. Thank you. I will talk with I have a question for Miriam Lexmann. And the first, I think that democracy is, I'm from non-democracy country, from Vietnam. So when I came to Harvard, Governor about democracy, and I was inspired, and I think about democracy very much. And now I think I recognize democracy is a very important value, very important foundation for peace and security in the world. This is my thinking from Vietnam. And also transparency, open, and Facebook, YouTube help to freedom for every country can use and accept. So I thank you for Governor Michael Dukakis. Choucri and Tom is a great mentor for me in democracy. So far today I talk about democracy, about that, and I think that the democracy is a very good example for Vietnam in COVID-19. Vietnam wonderful to control and prevent. No one died, and now nearly no one in hospital more. And society normalization. Vietnam open for transparency information. They listen from social media, opinion, and contribute for government. And all system for learn about democracy, transparency, open system. So I think from Vietnam now we can have good example for democracy. So how democracy can protect and democracy is fragmental. Many peace, many places we don't have unite. So my ideas for peace and security in the world for future. Governor, Joe, and my dear friends, how we can unite any resource, any democracy power in the world. And we need democracy not only in that a non-democracy country, sometimes in democracy country. We need government transparency and support for every people, freedom, and also equality of education, equality of information, equality of opportunities. That means, I think so. So we have ideas that are democratic alliance to join and to civil society and do that. That is a very important thing. We digital democracy now, AI technology to build and to digital can make democracy strong. Non-democracy country do now. We can make AI better. As Miriam Lexmann talk open today, speaking today, and I have question for Nguyen Lexmann. That is how IPAC Inter-Parliamentary on Alliance on China recently formed. We are very interested about that. So how, and I like it because many legislators from democratic country join and do and try to protect and strengthen democracy. I like that. And Boston Global Forum and Michael Dukakis Institute can contribute some solution, apply AI and make democracy more digital democracy, and how we can do. And I would like to learn from IPAC. You can talk about more mission strategy and how IPAC can join and how democracy power can join together and unite. My dream that is that we see democracy powers in the world unite and consolidated to make the world better, peace, security in the world. That is my ideas. And thank you so much, Governor Joe and Tom is my dear, great dear and mentors. Tell me and my thinking set me about democracy thinking today. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
I would like to ask Miriam Lexmann about IPAC, and could you talk about more IPAC?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tuan. I will maybe just briefly say and maybe add to Mr. Duncan Smith already mentioned, who is also co-chair from the British Parliament. The Inter-Parliamentary was practically established only very recently, but we have few pillars on which we would like to base our work. So far, we have co-chairs from many international parliaments, the US Parliament, British Parliament. I'm a co-chair from the European Parliament. There are more and more co-chairs coming from different parliaments worldwide. And obviously, these co-chairs will try to gain support in the individual parliaments and gather together parliamentarians who would like to join forces. We have agreed to base our work on 4 basic pillars, which is safeguarding international rules-based order, which means being vocal if international law is breached. This is the case, for example, a recent case with Hong Kong. So we try to gather forces and be vocal about this and try to also bring our governments that there will be not only outcry about this breach, but there will be also consequences. We discussed the potential Magnitsky Act. The European Union is discussing its own version of Magnitsky Act, so practically a global sanction act. So we hope that this will be put in force. And then obviously targeted sanctions against businesses can be also considered. We have to reshape our relations with China and future contracts and business deals and deals as such that they will reflect the reality. So the safeguarding international rules-based order is a pillar number 1. Upholding human rights is a pillar number 2. I discussed Article 21 of the EU treaties, where we said that the values on which the EU has been based should be values which should be brought into our international actions as the EU. Promoting trade fairness is a pillar number 3, and strengthening security, pillar number 4. We discuss the security aspects with 5G or drones or other aspects which have been mentioned, but as well the aspects where we see that our companies are part of the problem in China, because the development of new technologies are serving to suppress human rights and suppress human dignity rather than support it. So this is the issues we would like to deal with. And I don't know if Mr. Duncan Smith is still with us, or maybe if he has something to add as a co-chair, I will be happy to.
Have to leave soon because he have to come to vote today. Yes,
okay.
Because urgently emergency event in UK and London about Hong Kong today.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. Is our friend from Sweden going to be participating? Is he here? Andreas Norlén?
Yes, that is now. We have Senator.
Where is he? Is he with us?
Yes, he's here with us.
Can we get him into the discussion because we're running out of time here?
Yes. Yes, please. Senator.
Is he part of it? Andreas? Is he with us? Is he part of this discussion?
Yes, I see real speaker, and I think I saw. I will call her.
To the Swedish Parliament.
Yeah, Australia, Jordan Hang. That is she stay in computer up. Jordan Hang. She.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Okay. Wonderful.
Tuan, that's actually Kimberley.
Yes, Kimberley, Kitching. Yes.
Hold on, Kimberley, hold on just a second. What happened to the speaker of the Swedish Parliament? Is he not with us?
Yes. She now with us already, and we can invite Kimberley talk now, Governor, or you discuss.
Well, I want to get on with Kim. I'm wondering what happened to the speaker of the Swedish Parliament. Is he not part of the discussion?
No, she's yes, can discussion, and she will be speaker some minutes. She now here already, and she can talk and discuss now. See here, you can see him. I see her. You can see her. Yes.
I can see her, but I can't see him.
I see her. sorry. I'm sorry. So you can see her, and also Liam Burn here. Liam Burn from London also joined already. So I think Kimberley took first. Yes.
All right. So we're not going to hear from the Swedish parliamentarian. He's not with us.
No, here. See here. Already. She's ready to talk now.
I'm just talking about Andreas.
Maybe. I think.
Where's Andreas?
Kimberley, please talk. Governor, ask you talk now.
Oh, lovely.
Kick off this section with you, Kimberley, but we are going to hear from our Swedish friend, right?
Yes, yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Kimberley, go ahead.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Governor.
Thanks for being part of it.
I'd like to firstly thank the Boston Global Forum and, of course, Tuan for his great organisational ability. So thank you. And it was great to also hear from Iain Duncan Smith and Miriam, as well as co-chairs in the IPAC from other parts of the world. But it's been already, I think, a very successful joining of good forces for good in the world. I'd like to, before I begin in my presentation, I'd like to mention firstly that, of course, in Hong Kong, we've seen 300 people have been arrested in the last few hours, including a 15-year-old girl who was arrested under the new security laws for waving a pro-independence Hong Kong flag. Of course, in liberal democracies, we find such actions anathema. So we have to remember that people while we're speaking, people are protesting for their very liberties. Ostensibly, of course, this law was drafted to counter terrorism and separatism, but the new laws are so broad in scope and loose in definition that they will no doubt be applied in any manner that Beijing might see fit to pursue its own objectives. These laws are draconian, they silence legitimate dissent, they criminalise activities such as activism and the right of assembly that have been essential components of Hong Kong's autonomy and its unique status. Members of the Australian Hong Kong community have told me that they now fear for their safety and for the safety of their families in Hong Kong. There are over 100,000 Australians who were born in Hong Kong. The Chinese government considers all of them to be Chinese citizens for Chinese legal purposes. And we know this in Australia because we had what was fortunately an aborted extradition treaty process, which I'll expand on later. An activity as simple as communication with a person designated by Beijing as problematic could mean that they will be arrested and charged without judicial oversight if they are to return to Hong Kong. They also note that their family, friends and contacts who are in Hong Kong may be used as a form of hostage diplomacy if authorities cannot reach them. So to put this, to give a live example, in Australia this evening, it's 12:30 a.m. here on Thursday morning, but this evening in Australia in capital cities, there have been people gathering or lighting candles for the people of Hong Kong. And those people, if they have family in Hong Kong and they go back there, then they too may be arrested. We would, in Australia, both political parties would decry this kind of legislation. Trying to understand the motives of the Chinese leadership and the intricacies of its political system may at first seem incredibly dense and complicated, but we must remind ourselves that the CCP's ultimate and overarching aim is, of course, its own survival. The international community should pursue a values-based engagement with China and prosecute our interests as part of this engagement. It is not good enough for Beijing to say that what is happening in Hong Kong is a domestic matter or one of sovereignty, and by extension, not the business of other countries. As part of the handover, China and the United Kingdom signed a treaty under the Sino-British Joint Declaration, a treaty registered under the United Nations. This is a pivotal moment in history. What happens in Hong Kong matters to us all. I'd like to move to discuss the coronavirus and obviously, as we know, a few months ago, a localized coronavirus outbreak in China morphed into a global pandemic and now threatens the lives of millions worldwide. And in fact, in parts of Victoria, the state for which I'm a senator in the Commonwealth Parliament of Australia, we're actually just about an hour ago, or half an hour ago, parts of Melbourne, the capital city of Victoria, went back into lockdown. So, we are really battling this virus. Here in Australia, of course, there's going to be a contraction of economies. This is the greatest global health crisis since the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the greatest global economic crisis since the 1930s, worse than the Asian financial crisis, worse than the aftermath of 9/11, worse even than the global financial crisis. Here in Australia, the OECD has projected a negative 5% change in GDP this year due to COVID-19. This could blow out to a 6.3% downturn in the event of a double hit or second wave scenario. To put this in perspective, at the height of the global financial crisis in 2008, Australia's GDP only fell by 0.5%, and it only fell for one quarter. However, what we're watching around the world, indeed to some of the countries where you are watching from today, we consider ourselves lucky. The same OECD data projects the United Kingdom will experience an 11.5% write-down or 14% in the case of a second wave. The pandemic has shut down large swathes of the world economy, particularly tourism, aviation, entertainment, and education. While there's been some minor disruption to supply lines, especially from China back in February, trade in physical goods has not yet been directly affected. Coronavirus will inevitably lead to a deep and prolonged global recession, and a deep and prolonged global recession will inevitably impact on every sector. As legislators, the coronavirus pandemic has forced us to ask difficult questions about our economy. None of these questions are harder than how we will navigate the relationship between trade policy and the requirements of a sovereign state to meet a crisis of this kind. And Miriam has just taken us through the objectives of the IPAC, and one of those is obviously fair trade and a fair trading system. Few countries are more dependent on another for trade than Australia is on China. So this discussion has particular relevance for us. China is Australia's largest two-way trading partner. It accounts for over a quarter of total trade and receives more than a third of our exports. We are signatories to a free trade agreement, and they are a major source of foreign direct investment here. Back in April, many of us read with great interest the Sunday Times expose on the UK's pandemic plan. We learned that Britain had allowed its own PPE stockpile to run down as an economic measure because it assumed it could always buy more. And why wouldn't they? This is the basis of comparative advantage, the theoretical underpinning that has fueled the proliferation of global trade. But where does that leave you when the source of the emergency supplies of personal protective equipment needed during a pandemic is the world's leading PPE manufacturing centre in Wuhan, China, also the ground zero of the pandemic? In Australia, we saw a situation where two Chinese-owned property developers with a local presence, Greenland and Risland were the names of the two companies, directed their staff to secure more than 100 tonnes of medical equipment, which was then shipped back to China, resulting in a lack of local supply. While behaviour of this sort is not new, it has moved the dial on how Australians, who wouldn't otherwise be engaged in geopolitical debates, see a more assertive China. And I can assure you, Australians were not impressed. Recent trade data put out by the Patterson Institute for International Economics, showing the change in Chinese export prices from January and February 2020 to March 2020, tells us a global demand spike for Chinese-produced PPE sent prices skyrocketing in March as governments around the world scrambled to secure supplies. Polling by the Australian Foreign Affairs think tank, the Lowy Institute, reveals that a majority of Australians Chinese regime's willingness to act in the world's best interests. Australia is a country that has always lived by trade. Whether our principal export was gold, wool, wheat, iron ore, coal or natural gas, we have relied on exports of primary products to pay for the imported goods that make possible the relatively affluent lives enjoyed by the majority of Australians. This, combined with a healthy migration program, has been the leading factor in spurring on almost 3 decades of continuous economic growth. But a prolonged slump in world trade will hurt every sector of Australian society. We are just too exposed here. That's why it's been doubly unfortunate for Australia that COVID struck at a time when the world trade system is already under immense pressure. This has mainly been the result of the political and economic tensions between the United States and China and the subsequent intermittent trade wars between the world's two largest economies. Australia, perhaps more than any other country, has been placed in an invidious position by this conflict. But in contemplating how to position Australia as a strong, prosperous, unambiguously independent Western country in the Asian region, we must also recognise our own failings. Our wealth is built on the back of resource exports, but severely lacking in economic complexity and the ability to value add. The Harvard Atlas of Economic Complexity ranks us at 87, an export profile sandwiched somewhere between Uganda and Burkina Faso. We are also severely dependent on the whims and, more recently, the temper tantrums of one country. China, under President Xi Jinping, aspires to become a hegemonic power in the Asia-Pacific region. Its recent actions have been an attempt to drive the United States out of the region and reduce the countries of Southeast Asia and the Pacific to the status of Chinese dependencies. At the same time, the United States has indicated that it expects its Pacific allies to invest more in their own security. As a result, Australia is being forced to increase capacity to meet its own defence needs from domestic sources, as well as reduce its dependence on foreign suppliers. There is a broad consensus among Australian policymakers that this needs to be done. The problem, however, is how. In Australia, we have often been slow to take a clear stand on democratic principles when it comes to China. The inconvenient truth is that Australian governments, particularly since 2013, when President Xi first came into a prominent role, have sent China mixed messages. Before eventually coming to their senses and pulling the legislation in 2017, the current Australian government very nearly pushed through an extradition treaty with the Chinese government. It has been a long time coming. It percolated its way through a lengthy process requested by the Chinese government, facilitated by the diplomats at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and then particularly championed by the then Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. The implications of this for national security, for individual freedom, and for our reputation would have been devastating. That the then Foreign Minister pushed this proposal so far, in my view, is a terrible stain on her record as Foreign Minister. No longer can China's rise be seen through the prism of a benign international actor only interested in domestic matters. So ubiquitous is the coverage of issues such as political interference, intellectual property theft, non-transparent political donations, and the tacit agreements these come with, as well as academic espionage. It has all but drowned out reporting of the positives of the Australia-China bilateral relationship. And over the last week, we have actually had a series of fingers point towards Beijing. And of course, our parliamentary email system has been the victim of sustained cyber attacks over many years. And of course, people say this isn't really, what a trading partner might do. Australia's actually had hundreds of years of Chinese migration, including large numbers of Chinese immigrants in the Australian gold rushes in the 1850s. It has deep business and trade linkage, those things that come to our mind when we talk about China today. But public sentiment in Australia, democratic Hong Kong, is at breaking point. But we have also seen the release of a report that outlines the extent to which officials in Xinjiang province are forcing women to undergo sterilisation surgeries and have IUD devices fitted in an apparent attempt to curb the birth rate among Muslim minority communities. The co-chairs of the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China were privileged to receive a pre-briefing on this report from its author. China's standing among the international community is at its lowest point since its reform era began over 3 decades ago. For Australia, we've had to adapt an Asia-Pacific have had to adapt to an Asia-Pacific region in which China has emerged over this period as a dominant economic power. We've always been proactive in advancing the relationship. Former Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam recognised the People's Republic in 1972, earning enormous goodwill in China. Former Australian Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating further developed the relationship throughout the 1980s and 1990s, taking advantage of China's economic and political opening to the world under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. The growth of trade with China has been of huge overall benefit to Australia. It has opened up a new export market, not just for coal, iron ore and natural gas, but also for agricultural products. It's been a boon for new or expanding industries such as education, tourism, hospitality, financial services, media and the arts. But this mutually beneficial trade relationship was always predicated on the assumption that China would be a rational player in the field of trade, would abide by the rules set down by the World Trade Organization, and would act in the interests of the growth and prosperity of all in an increasingly interconnected region. That assumption held good to a large extent under the reformist rule of Deng Xiaoping and his successors. But China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has shown a willingness to use trade, investment, tourism, foreign aid, and Chinese communities outside China as weapons in its drive to establish a regional hegemony in the Asia-Pacific and to challenge the liberal world order. Under Xi's regime, China has sought to use its economic power to bully and intimidate its regional neighbours into compliance, to interfere in the democratic processes of foreign countries, exploit the increasing financial reliance of other nations, use students to promote CCP policy and silence criticism, attempt to recruit agents of influence in democracies worldwide, and intimidate its diaspora. In Australia, it has enrolled business leaders with large investment stakes in China to act as surrogates for Chinese policies, a tactic we see mirrored by apologists in politics, media, and academia around the world. To top all of this off, we now have a conflict between China and the democratic world over responsibility for the global disaster that is the coronavirus pandemic. It's no surprise that the facts about this are disputed by the Chinese government. As is always the case with authoritarian regimes, the first thing they do is attempt to cover up the problem. Few could doubt China has greatly embarrassed itself through its reaction to the pandemic and the reputational consequences it has undoubtedly faced around the world. Australia has led the international community in its demands for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus outbreak. This is a reasonable request, not least because it will help us put in place policies to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and in turn that will make the world a safer place. But China has predictably lashed out at Australia for taking this position. In the past few months, we have had selective tariffs imposed on Australian exports. And it doesn't take a cynic to reach the conclusion that this is punishment for our temerity. Governor Dukakis, you mentioned in the previous session how important continuing dialogue is with Chinese officials. The Trade Minister has made repeated attempts to contact his counterpart in China, and those phone calls have not been answered. Those emails haven't been answered. In fact, there has been no response. So we think that, they've been acting like a jilted lover, in a breakup, threats, rants, retaliations, the works. So similarly, we've had suggestions from Beijing that Chinese students should not return to Australia when that becomes possible. In these circumstances, it has become increasingly difficult to maintain a normal relationship with China. And ultimately, it has drawn many to the conclusion that while we hoped and expected that the world would change China, it is in fact China that is trying to change the world. This should encourage us to reflect on the vulnerabilities that the coronavirus outbreak has revealed. China is a sovereign nation. It has every right to reject calls for such an inquiry. However, China is also a country with global ambitions, and with these come a responsibility to engage with the international rules-based system and agreed upon norms as a good global actor. I won't talk for other countries, but for Australia, disengagement is not an option, and nor should it be. However, it is true that our relationship with China is entering a new phase, a widely accepted view across the political spectrum here. Constructive engagement is a term that is also a much abused term, and we should be very wary of applying it to undemocratic and oppressive regimes. Nevertheless, democracies are right to engage in constructive engagement with China, provided that basic principles are not violated. But we need to be more hard-headed about this process than we have been in the past. Our values should be known and placed front and centre when dealing with Chinese government officials. And while many would urge we just shut up and take the money, this is non-negotiable, and we must never capitulate to intimidation and threats. After all, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. I already mentioned negative perceptions of China's intentions as polled by Australia's Law Institute. This same poll, which was released maybe 10 days ago, also found that 94% also think that Australia should reduce our economic dependence on China. That's 94% surveyed. We can and should seek to do this by broadening and deepening our economic relationships with other established and emerging powers. In our region, this would include India, Indonesia, as well as the member states of ASEAN. And we should do this as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kimberley. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Dick, are you next?
Yes, I guess I am. I need to get some slides up there so you can see them.
Very clearly. Good.
Can you see them now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Good. So Tuan asked me to speak about the impact of the pandemic on the global economy and to say a little bit about supply chain changes. So this is really more about the broad economic context than just China. So if you can see the slide that we're looking at, it shows the IMF's most recent forecast, which just came out a few days ago. It's more pessimistic than previous forecasts. You can see that they're suggesting that the world economy is going to drop by about 4.9% this year. And you can see that it's quite negative for the United States and even more negative for the European Union, especially for Italy, Spain, and France. But you can also see, if you look on down, that Japan is having a tough problem, that India, which really worries me quite a bit, is having sharp negative growth in deep negative territory. I'm not sure people realize the damage that this is doing to the world economy, and that the length of time it's going to take to recover from it, which is a point I want to make in just a second. Let me go to the next slide. If I can make the slides work here. Let me just page down. So this is the US economy right here. And you can see that in the first quarter, it's gone sharply negative by 5.2%. And when the second quarter numbers come out the day after tomorrow, it's probably going to be worse. This is our unemployment rate, which most of you have heard of. It's gone up to about 15%. It's dropped back down to about 13%. This is not going to go away anytime soon. It will be several years before our unemployment rate comes back down again. We've spent a lot of money trying to slow down the economic catastrophe. More than $3 trillion has now been spent. But I want to just show you that this is going to cause our fiscal deficit to be negative this year by about 3.5 times what it was negative last year. And it was already deeply negative last year because of the Trump tax cuts. So this is a forecast for the United States of our fiscal deficit, of our debt, and because of that, the consequences for several of our important trust funds, especially Social Security and Medicare. So it's very likely that our debt to GDP will jump from about 79% to about 118% this year. Now, with very low interest rates, we can probably afford that. But if interest rates go up by as much as 1%, our debt service is going to be overwhelming. So the IMF also put out the fiscal balances and gross debt for a bunch of the countries whose economies it forecasts. And I just want to show you this. You can see that the United States gross debt, not the debt held by the public, but the gross debt actually goes up to about 140%. You can see Italy's debt is at 160%. And as you all know, Italy is not growing. So again, if interest rates go back up to 1.5%, Italy and perhaps Spain and Greece and Portugal will not be able to afford their debt service. You can see the debt is also very significant for India. You can see it's very significant for Brazil. So, this financial crisis is going to be a problem, not just this year and next year, but in 2022, 23, and 24. Let me say a word about global value chains. This is a map of the value chains showing who innovates, who manufactures, where raw materials come from. And you can see the Australian contribution to raw materials. You can see that China is the largest intermediate manufacturer. I want to show you China's real GDP very quickly. You can see that it's gone sharply negative. The previous forecast I just showed you shows them recovering at 1% by the end of the year. That remains to be seen. This is what's happened to Chinese trade, and you can see it's gone down, not sharply, but it's gone down. I do want to say one thing on China's behalf. China's gotten a lot of grief for slowing exports of the medical equipment that the rest of the world needed. And this chart shows that they actually slowed their medical exports less than their overall exports. So I don't think they were really trying to hurt the rest of the world in pandemic situation. This shows U.S. trade, and you can see it's sharply dropped. So if you think about the U.S.-Chinese trade relationship, it's really withering, and it's withering more on the U.S. side than the Chinese side. So this is a recent, very recent, last week study of supply chains. And this is something that began several years ago, but has really accelerated because of the pandemic. A lot of companies are trying to rebalance their supply chains, shifting some of their business out of China, perhaps to Vietnam, perhaps to Bangladesh, certainly to India, and also to Mexico, which is interesting. And it's especially U.S. firms that are doing this. You'll notice that European firms have not moved very much of their supply chain. So let me just offer a couple of thoughts on what's happening to these global supply chains. First of all, the disruptions are not new. We've seen them before with the Japanese tsunami and the global financial crisis. But in those cases, they were either supply shocks or demand shocks. The pandemic is presenting both supply and demand shocks. So this is really exceptional. And it hits all the major economic centers simultaneously, which the previous shocks did not. So the companies involved are trading off just-in-time production, hyper-specialization, minimizing inventories for more political sustainability. And of course, the US-China trade wars have significantly exacerbated this. Both we're seeing reshoring to the United States and diversification again to Vietnam and Bangladesh and Mexico. And this is all part of what I consider to be a deglobalization trend that began 2 or 3 years ago. So I'm gonna end here very quickly by saying a couple of words of general conclusions. These are not the only ones. These are the ones that, from an economics point of view, I think are most important. So let me just point to these, because I think it's important to think about the US-China relationship in the context of the global economy. So the first point is that everyone is running larger deficits and therefore incurred more debt. So that's an important point. As I just showed with the United States, our deficit was 1.1 trillion. And now this year it's going to be 3.7 trillion. And that assumes that we don't pass more economic stimulus in August, which Congress is currently discussing. So the debt is going to rise sharply. And it's going to do that in Europe. It's going to do that in Japan. It's going to do that in the United States, in India, in Brazil, in Australia, everywhere. Debt service, therefore, is going to rise as soon as we have any inflation and an increase in interest rates. That's a big deal. If debt service only goes up by, if interest rates only go up by 1 or 1.5%, debt service as part of a fiscal budget could rise tremendously. Many states will not be able to afford that, particularly the southern tier of Europe, some of the Latin American countries, Argentina, obviously, Venezuela, perhaps Colombia, perhaps Brazil, and many African countries won't be able to afford it and are already having their debt deferred by the IMF. So I think we've got an economic situation that is going to hang over all of us for several years. The second point I would just make here is that I think government intervention in the economy is normalizing. For those of us who support a capitalist environment, I think we're going to see government becoming a much larger player in the economy. If you think about the United States, it's obvious that healthcare is going to be more important, but also minimum wages, income inequality. These are issues that the Republican Party has not been willing to deal with. Those are going to be becoming part of our economic policy. Let me go to the third point, which is deglobalization. And again, I think this is accelerated. It is accelerated for two reasons, partly because of the pandemic and its effects on trade and the movement of people, but partly because of the policies of the Donald Trump administration, which I think have been a catastrophe for the United States. Number 4 is US-China relations. And you all have talked about that for several hours now. We've really pushed these in a negative direction for the last 3.5 years. They've really have reached a low ebb with the Hong Kong decision yesterday. I think we have to think about this. China and the United States simply have to get along. We cannot have a war. So we have to think about what both countries need as a minimum, and where and how we're going to continue to function together in the future. Finally, I would just point to the fifth consequence, which is that I think European economic integration is under severe pressure because of the economic effects of the virus. Northern Europe is in pretty good shape. Southern Europe is a catastrophe. We saw this with the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. Northern Europe had to bail out Southern Europe. This is a much larger economic crisis, and I think Northern Europe is less inclined to bail out Southern Europe, which needs it much more. So one could think about many other microeconomic impacts, but these are the macro impacts that I see that this virus has created. So I'll leave it there and let someone else talk. Thank you.
Dick, thanks so much for that excellent discussion.
Governor, Fujisaki from Japan too late now, so could you allow him talk now about 3 minutes? Yeah.
Where is he? Where is our friend?
Thank you very much.
Ambassador Fujisaki, yes.
Ichiro Fujisaki here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Thank you. Tuan-san, you may be surprised, but I'm so grateful to Xi Jinping and Chinese government. Why? Because now we don't see too much leadership of United States. So if China really did the diplomacy very smartly, maybe they could have toppled world international order, but they have made a blunder in Wuhan. They have made a mistake with not inviting Taiwan to WHO. They have also, when they were giving out the aids, they have angered Australia, France, and other countries. All these mistakes. So no one became friends. And I thought we were very much saved, not only United States, but Japan in a way. Why so? It's because of autocratic system they have. They're all watching, not only Beijing, only the leader, not about other countries. That's why all these blunders are coming. And then what we should do, I think 3 C's are important. Coherence in thinking, consistent action, collaboration amongst like-minded countries. As for United States, our leader, we would like to think about 2 things. Respect international organization, not hopping out of WHO, WTO, whatever. Try to use it, because if you leave, China would try to take advantage of it. That's point 1. Point 2, if and when, I don't know if that'll happen, after the election, new administration comes in. I hope everyone says that even if any party would come in, they will be very tough to China. I don't believe it, because we've seen so many things in the past, but they have changed. For example, we were with Mr. Clinton in giving nuclear reactor to North Korea. Mr. Bush came in and said, Bush 43 came in and said, no way. After that, he said, let's go to Iraq. And we joined the Iraq war. Mr. Obama came in and said, no way, that was wrong. Let's do TPP. Then Mr. Trump came in and said, no way, why TPP? So we've always changed our policy with the United States. I hope next time the administration changes. It should be 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50 degrees change, but not 180 degrees change. That's the two things. International organization and the sort of the way you change the policy. Of course, it's not easy to say, but easy not really to really do it. But still, these are two things I'd like you to keep in mind. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me my time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Fujisaki.
Thank you, Johnson.
All right, Sandy,
Okay,
where are you?
I'm coming.
Okay.
Let's see if this is the right one. Okay, good. So hopefully you can see this.
Yeah.
So I'm going to talk about rebuilding the economy here, and in particular with respect to China. And this is actually an open source book that's on the MIT Press website, so you can go to there and get it and see it if you want. So the situation you just heard Dick talking about is debt has gone up dramatically. It's worth asking what happened in the past. So the strategy after World War I and World War II was something that is sometimes called financial repression, high inflation, low interest rates. That allows the government to get rid of the debt. It also means stimulus for people who have access to those sort of cheap things. So typically big companies, but not little companies, unfortunately. So what's going to happen today? Well, currently inflation is very low, right? Well, no, actually, if you look at actually consumer goods and not the official statistics, you see inflation that is 6-7%, but yet interest rates are low because of quantitative easing. And my friends who actually keep track of these things by scraping the web and looking at all the prices around the whole world say that currently we're looking at 6-7% interest per inflation per year. But yet interest rates are low and seem to be likely to remain low as long as the quantitative easing policies are in place. So what does that do to our economies? Well, one of the things about it is that sort of financial repression makes the infrastructure investment attractive as opposed to export other sorts of financial investment. So infrastructure is attractive because it has a dual bottom line. You're not getting monetary return, but you are getting better schools, better housing. And in fact, this is the strategy used by Singapore, Korea, and China. I do talk fairly regularly with a very senior leadership in these countries, but it's the economic leadership. And they're fairly open about admitting that this is exactly what they do to be able to grow the sort of spectacular ways that they have. But it has a downside, and that is it's basically a Ponzi scheme. It's a pyramid scheme. And the sustainability of this depends on attracting outside commerce. So in the case of Singapore and Korea, this worked out very well. And they've been doing this since after World War II, of course. China is only halfway through. And this is why Belt and Road is so absolutely critical to them. If you go to China, you see all this infrastructure that's been built in anticipation of large-scale investment, large-scale commerce. And that's the reason for the Belt and Road. And if that doesn't pan out, China's in real trouble. Digital currencies are something that you may not be paying attention to, but you may have heard that China already has a digital currency, a sort of blockchain type currency. It's currently prototyped in many parts of China, and it's beginning to be used outside. So all of that debt that countries owe to China So in Africa, elsewhere, all the trade may be denominated in this Chinese digital currency. Let me just give you an example. This is infrastructure that was built in Pakistan, denominated in this type of digital currency. And it's good in many ways because actually the main stakeholders here are the local community for this hydroelectric plant. But it's actually part of a critical part of Belt and Road also because it provides electricity for the railway that's being built, et cetera, and was led by China and this sort of national digital currency. What that means is that you can see a couple years out that there'll be something like $1 trillion of Chinese digital currency denominating all of the African, Latin American, South Asian debt and trade. It'll be a real challenge to the dollar and the IMF because it will be faster, cheaper, more trustworthy, but at the end, controlled by the Chinese national government. Now, everybody can play this game, but the West is not doing that. We're being very cautious. And the reason that we can do it is that we have the technology. So far, the only examples of this are things that, for instance, we set up with, my group set up with Fidelity, Intuit, things like that. But we've seen large-scale proposals for it that are quite reasonable to do. And we see also that some of these things about data and some of these new technologies allow us to predict what are good investments much better than we ever could before. So for instance, we have now the capacity to predict much better what sort of infrastructure investments will actually result in return on investment. And we have a large project in Australia, this is in Southern Australia, to be able to use this sort of data digital currency methodology to increase jobs, make the economy more global, and particularly in the sort of local area. And what I would suggest is these same type of techniques can be used anywhere in South Asia, in fact, anywhere in the world. But it's particularly important in South Asia, which it wants to avoid becoming controlled by the Chinese economy. So you need to actually make an alternative trading zone that has the same level of efficiency, outcome, that you can do using these digital techniques, which is, of course, what China is doing. So we're not competing on the digital scientific investment front in the way that we need to in order to maintain viable economies. And I'll just stop there. I know time is short. Hopefully that will be good for people. And let people go. I just want to conclude by saying a way to get around this is the problems that we're in is we have to be innovative in how we invest. We have to be strategic in how we invest. And we have enormous new tools that allow us to do this. It shouldn't be the same old business, the same old methodologies. If we go the same old way, it's going to be a much harder battle. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, let's go to our panel and get some relatively short comments from them, starting with Liam. Liam, you've been with us, and I see you. Liam Byrne.
Yep, Liam, we don't hear you.
There we go. How's that? Is that a little bit better? Great. Governor, thanks so much for inviting me again.
Thank you for joining us.
Organising. I graduated from the Harvard Business School 20 years ago. I was supposed to be in Cambridge this year for our 20th anniversary reunion, and the restrictions meant I couldn't come, and so this is as close as I'm going to get. So thank you very much indeed for giving me a Cambridge moment in the summer of 2020. We have been old friends on this call, a number of us, and so as an old friend, I'm going to speak my mind, and I hope I don't throw too many rocks in the pool and strike too many discordant notes, but a lot of the tone of what I've heard has troubled me greatly, and so I'm going to present some different perspectives, a perspective from the European left. I'm going to say a word about optimism and pessimism, and I'm going to say a word about what I think we need to do together next. Over the last 10 years, I've helped anchor the UK-China relationship. 7 years ago, I published a book, Turning to Face the East, which was written at a time when Britain and China were beginning to celebrate what was called a golden era. And I've watched that golden era become the dark day that we have today, with the effective suspension of human rights in Hong Kong, what our Prime Minister called a few hours ago a grave breach of the agreement that we struck with China all those years ago. And as a result of that, we will be offering a path to British citizenship for 3 million people. I'm also part of a generation of European politicians who were elected in the middle of a war 13, 14, 15 years ago. And much of the political work, many of the problems that I've had to address have been caused by the terrible errors of Western foreign policy in the Middle East. And so the argument that I want to put to you today about tone is that it would be naive if we were to try and solve these problems, recognizing the beam in our own eye. And I say that in a spirit of friendship because our task here is to try and create load-bearing structures for difficult conversations and, crucially, better cooperation over the years to come. And if we're not honest about the mistakes that we have made, then frankly, we are not going to mobilize the coalition for change that we're going to need to make things happen. So from where we sit in London, we see it's not China that's blocking reform at the WTO, it's the United States. It's not China that is stopping the extension of special drawing rights at the IMF to help impoverished countries deal with the debts of COVID. It's the United States. It's not China that's threatening to defund the WHO, it's the United States. It's not China that's cutting its funding at the United Nations. And so unless good people across the West are able to re-summon the moral imagination to reinvest in a new generation of institutions, then frankly, we are going to see the kind of Cold War between the United States and China that I remember from my childhood between East and West. Now, where does that take me? That takes me actually to something that Chairman Mao used to say quite a lot. Chairman Mao, I think he said this in 1954 in Moscow for the first time. He said, it was an old Chinese folk saying that counseled against the foolishness of lifting up a rock only for the rock to fall on one's feet. That is an insight actually that we need to build on, because the key for our relationships with China over the course of the next 20 years are to actually move a group of countries, including China, from loose understandings towards clubs and from clubs to institutions, because what we have to do is to try and create a rules-based order where misbehavior has consequences and the stone falls on both feet. So rather than take the tone that we see bedeviling the American elections at the moment, actually we need to be more politically creative to organize the institutions that create negative consequences for bad behavior. And right now, I have to tell you, we're failing to do that. So the reason that for us in Europe, this is so significant is because we are turning east for all sorts of reasons. But the biggest reason is money. By 2050, the economies of the Silk Road will be worth about 2.5 times the value of the economies of the Atlantic seaboard. So, of course, European countries are going to be looking east. And that means we're interested in infrastructure, how you finance infrastructure, where that finance comes from, where that debt is sold, how it's governed, how it's regulated, how conflicts are resolved, how there's a digital layer to it, how tariffs are organized. In other words, we need to move from understandings to clubs and from clubs to institutions. What we basically are going to need to invent is something like an OECD for the new Silk Road, where we can create, in effect, a rules-based order for the new Silk Road. At the moment, we don't see American leadership in that. We don't see British leadership in that. We don't see European leadership in that. But it is going to be crucial to us sustaining a level of cooperation for the years to come. And here I come on to my point about optimism and pessimism. I was an idealist once, and I'm not anymore. I've made too many mistakes, and I've seen too many setbacks in Western politics. Iain Duncan Smith is no longer on the call, but for a number of us here in the UK, Brexit is one of the most suicidal acts that the British public has ever inflicted on itself. It will create tremendous problems for us in the years ahead. But what I see as a frontline politician now who struggles with the business of getting re-elected every 4 or 5 years is what Simon Sharma, the historian who I think is now based at Princeton, calls a return to the tribes. We now see a nasty, pervasive nationalism dividing politics around the world. There's an old Greek hero called Cadmus. Cadmus is the founder of Thebes. And Cadmus succeeds by slaying a dragon, and then he sows the dragon teeth in the fields. And from these dragon teeth pop up heavily armed warriors standing to attention, ready for battle. And to stop these warriors killing him, Cadmus throws a stone, a precious jewel, into the middle of them, and they turn on each other and begin killing each other. Well, what we see authoritarian nationalists do now is sow dragon's teeth amongst their populations. They are dividing people one from another, and crucially, once they reach office, they are destroying institutions, whether that is the American Constitution, whether it is the tradition of judicial rule, whether it is the tradition of free press. And this creates the risk, frankly, of state disintegration over the next 20 years. Because weak institutions, as people like Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson in their great book, Why Nations Fail, what they tell us is that states with weak institutions are unable to navigate the challenges of the time. And think about the challenges that now lie ahead. We have what I've called the 3 rises ahead of us: the rise in temperature, the rise in technology, and the rise in trade battles. Those 3 transitions will cost hundreds of millions of jobs. And if states don't navigate those challenges effectively, we will see the inequality that we have seen for hundreds of years. In fact, if current trends persist, the top 1% won't own half of global wealth as they do today by 2030. They'll own 2/3. That's about $215 trillion. It will be impossible for us to restore a measure of equality this century if that is allowed to happen. But the political consequence of that will be state breakup. So about 100 years ago, there were about 7 or 8 important successionist movements around the world. Today, there are somewhere between 70 and 80. And in places like Spain, in places indeed like Germany, in Southern Europe, in Italy in particular, in our own country, in Scotland, those independence movements are becoming more and more powerful. And they trade on failure, and they trade on the poison that inequality injects into the political bloodstream. If the state system that we have today begins to break up, then governing the global commons, whether that is the internet, whether that is the oceans, whether that is the poles, will become much, much harder. And frankly, that will debilitate our ability to summon global cooperation on existential threats like climate change. So, I am now, very clear that as a Western politician, we're at a fork in the road. One road, frankly, leads to dystopia. The other road leads to a new collective will to rebuild institutions. But that will require us to break decisively with the settlement that Ronald Reagan and Barry Goldwater inaugurated all those decades ago in the United States, that basically says government is the problem. Actually, the new agenda that we have to put forward is that government is going to have to be the solution. We will need creative states to foster better kinds of industrial policy. We need, I believe, a second Bill of Rights. I've been reading Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, Economic Bill of Rights a lot recently, and Cass Sunstein's excellent biography of it. we will need to define with greater specificity the kinds of civic rights that political leaders will need to deliver in the 21st century. And around that, we will need to build a new social contract and social security systems. Because unless we equip people with the ability to accumulate wealth, with the ability to train, retrain, retrain, and retrain again, and crucially use their pension investments in order to direct much better behavior amongst corporates, then we're not going to be able to modernize states in the way that is going to be needed to combat the secular trends towards inequality. So I'll conclude by just remembering actually the first class I took at Harvard. So, well, I don't know, guys, if this is still true, but back in my day, the first case study they gave you was Morgan Friedman's article on the purpose of business is profit, and that always provoked a pretty lively debate. You know, right now around the world, we are seeing a phenomenal rise in the number of pension savers, and we're seeing organizations like the US Business Roundtable begin to say in terms that the era of shareholder primacy is now dead. But unless we can mobilize popular capitalism to restore a level of moral economy to our markets, and alongside renew states around a second Bill of Rights and modern social security systems, then I cannot see how we're going to combat the inequality that is destroying our ability to cooperate. So I'm normally a lot happier at these kinds of meetings, but I guess I've lost too many elections. And I suppose, you know, where we are on the British left at the moment is at a moment of great change. Everybody is talking about building back better in the future, but the truth is nobody wants a restoration of what came before. The collapse of the Sanders project and the Corbyn project here in the UK has now closed off the revolutionary path to change. And so the exam question for a lot of us now, if we don't want a restoration and we don't want a revolution, well, what does the Reformation look like? And at the heart of that movement for a reformation has got to become a renewal of cooperation, because ultimately cooperation is the midwife of the freedom and the liberty that we enjoy. So those are just a few kind of slightly gloomy reflections on what I've heard and where I think we may need to think about going next. Governor, I'll stop there, but thanks for the platform.
And thank you. And there are a number of us who share your feelings on the subject. We're going to do our best to head in that direction, I hope. Okay, Tuan, who's next?
Professor Koichi Hamada.
Is he with us?
Yeah. Koichi Hamada, Yale University. He is a special advisor to Prime Minister Abe. Please, Koichi. Koichi.
Koichi, are you with us, Hamada?
Yes, I hear here. He here in the list, but I don't know why don't hear. Professor Koichi Hamada. IPA.
Koichi Hamada.
Okay.
Hamada.
Can we all hear?
Hamada Sensei. Koichi Hamada.
Okay, I think Koichi Hamada ready? Okay, so I think later we will, Governor, please invite Mr. Namphap, Assistant Secretary of Massachusetts.
Good morning. Governors, you look great, and I can't wait to see you back in Massachusetts.
I'm back in Massachusetts, but they won't let me out of the house.
Oh, wonderful.
Which is okay, not letting anybody out of the house, which is one of the reasons we're in better shape than a lot of places these days. Anyway, it's so good to see you and hear you. So
sure. I think we've been talking about the relationship between China and the US and every other countries. Whenever we're talking about a relationship, it reminds me of an American saying, "It takes two to tango." And both have to dance with the same music and the same tune. And regarding our relationship with China, China has not been dancing to the same tune with all of us. During the dance, whether it's economic or politics or anything else, China step on our toe, kick on our knee, pick our pockets, and we blame ourselves. We blame ourselves that we are not a good dancer. So I think I'm totally agree with many of our speakers that right now is a good time for us to take another look at that kind of relationship, to reshape it, to establish a rule-based behavior. And I think the key. Should I continue?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is Hamada, and my microphone is now on.
Okay, so do later. You after Mr. Nam Phạm finish, you talk later. After follow Nam Phạm continue.
Okay.
Yes, and in Massachusetts, we have had a good relationship, a trading relationship with many countries. And our experience with China, I'd like to share with you a couple of examples. Northeastern University in 2018 did studies on how the trade deficit between Massachusetts and China had impacted our economy. And it concluded that between the year 2000 and 2017, it cost Massachusetts almost 100,000 jobs in manufacturing. So that's, I think we need to keep in mind. And also, we are talking about the benefit of trading with China over the last 40 years since Nixon and Kissinger opened up China and the US and the world. I'm just wondering if we somehow, some of our big academic would make a cost analysis between that benefit against the cost of COVID, which caused by basically many mistakes by China, and make that comparison between the cost to our economies, which I think Professor from business school mentioned earlier, the cost to our economies, the cost to human lives. I'm not sure it has been beneficial to all of us, or as much as we think. And regarding thinking, I think our relationship with China has been based on a kind of wishful thinking. We wish that, we hope that by engaging China will be more like us. But I don't think we pay attention enough to the value system of China, especially the Chinese Communist government, is quite different from us, from the value we put on human lives to the rule of law. During world trade activities, for example, there's always some business intellectual theft. Companies steal from others. But China is the first example that is not a company, but it's a country. It has been the Chinese national policy to steal from us. So that's, I think, very, very important. Governor Dukakis also asked a very, I think, pointed questions, whether or not we are, US and China are going to a Cold War. I think a better question would be, how are we going to defend ourselves from Chinese government attacks? Because China has been attacking all of us. They use all the kind of weapons that at their disposal. It may not be a gun shooting at us, but many weapons that have been used to attacking the Western world. And also, I think for many countries that were Chinese, that are Chinese neighbors, Japan, Vietnam, you name it, Philippines, it's not a hysterical saying that China is invading us or China is going to cause a lot of problem, because China has been doing that. So I think if we're looking at that relationship, we should also try to see what kind of behaviors, what kind of consequences that behavior would cause. Liam mentioned earlier, there need to be some negative consequences. You have to drop the rock on 2 feet if they behave badly. And for our relationship, our experience with China, we have not done that. We have not been critical enough, but we more are blaming ourselves. Miriam mentioned earlier that we need to talking about human rights because it's a moral obligation. I think it's more than just a moral obligation. It's a responsibility for our leaders to talk about human rights, to do something about abuses of human rights, because it's a real threat to our existence. And regarding trade, any country, if we look around, any country that respects human rights, they are much, much better trading partner than any country that did not share that basic value. So I think it's more than an opportunity to review our relationship with China, but we better do it quick before it's too late. Thank you.
Thanks.
Koichi Hamada.
I won't comment except to say that since we are supporting dictatorships all over the world, it raises interesting questions about what the United States of America is doing these days. And needless to say, I hope that's going to change in about 4 months. Okay, let's go to Professor
Koichi Hamada.
Thank you.
You are with us. Welcome.
This invitation. I'm afraid both hegemons, China and US, failed to manage this crisis. So the timing of this conference, concentrating on other parts of the world, is very important, I think. I'd like to say 3 things. We are experiencing, like, I didn't manage it too well, but doing things online rather than, and I could write papers, attend conferences, discuss with others, advising Prime Minister. All are done online now. And after this turmoil, I hope the world learns from the practice of doing online without moving, without meeting at the farm, always overworking, sometimes to death in the case of Japan. Those things will be changed more rationally. Secondly, it is a temporary, I hope, this location of many things unexpectedly. And the economies of most countries were doing quite fine until this coronavirus attacked us. And if this dislocation stays in a short time, then we can recover to the past world and start working well. So as long as the time of cure from this virus is under limited time, it is fine. Otherwise, supply chain may be broken in such a way it is hard to recover, and so forth. And I rather substantially disagree with Professor Dick Vicker, who represent the old school of financial balances. If something emergency happens, then government shouldn't be worried about spending money to save people's life, particularly people in poverty or disadvantaged group of people. And what I see in the contrast between Democrats and old Republicans plus the president is that the economy should increase national income, so national income first before people are rescued. That's a Republican or president sometimes viewpoint. On the other hand, we think that those people who were damaged most seriously should be rescued. And the social philosophy, the social system overall should be built to enhance the welfare of the least advantaged group of people or least handicapped people. That is what Harvard John Rawls developed his philosophy. Since we have many interests and preoccupied position, we can't be fair. But if we think about the world where we don't know how I will be born in health, in social circumstances, or in wealth, then people would like to seek the society as a just one, social justice. So it is a time of reconsidering very much John Rawls' philosophy that we need not just maximize the income, maximize the GDP, or maximize the Wall Street market value. And finally, I would like to repeat that government budget is not the ultimate objective of the society. Another Harvard professor told me when he was in CEA that government budget should be always or almost always balanced. Is not the right theory. In order to so compare the world where government doesn't spend much and many supply chains are broken and students are uneducated. Contrast with the world that government do not spend. The government spend for those necessary things about this drastic, disturbed world shortly, I hope. Then the future generation, the fiscal conservatives always worry about the fiscal generation that they will lose because we don't pay taxes or we have deficit. But fiscal generation will face much less productive facilities. They will face much less educated people. So I think this erroneous view that government should always balanced budget should be considered. As a matter of fact, Japanese government deficit is thought to be the worst, 2.4 times of GDP. It is very much emphasized by people and particularly by the Ministry of Finance of Japan. However, for example, Doug Decker, the recent book with the IMF indicates that Japan, if you count the real asset and asset like foreign exchange and so forth, then the government is not at all poor relative to European countries and so forth. Thank you very much for getting.
Thanks, Professor. We have a couple of speakers left who I hope will keep things quite brief. And I think the former president of Ecuador is with us. Is he not? Emil?
Emil.
And David, you're with us.
Emil.
Yes, I'm with you.
Is Camilla here?
I'm here. Yep.
Yes, okay, please.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tuan. We had a conversation with former heads of state of Latin America recently about the effects of the pandemic in our countries. And the first thing that we said was, we are in the same boat. At the end of the conversation, we said, no, we are not in the same boat. We are in the same storm, but in very different boats. So this is a first conclusion for the comparison between the part of my part of the world and the rest of the world. Second, how does the Latin American boat looks like? I strongly recommend that we incorporate in our conversations the social component of the problem. We talk a lot about economics and technology, but the social aspect is so important that I would invite every one of us to stress that part as well. So basically, 2 or 3 indicators. The first one, we have lost in one trimester, Latin America, what we had gained in 10 years before. That is the impact in the social sector. We have more poverty, more unemployment. We have fewer and fewer people covered by Social Security with all the benefits that Social Security brings with it. And we have changed policies that before were constructed as institutions to deal with the social aspects to assistentialism. We have had to go back to give money, bonuses for people that are hungry, unemployed, etc. So that's a real disaster for all of our countries. Then we are entering in the IPAC world. I for inequality, P for polarization, E for exclusion, and X for xenophobia. I am really concerned about that. In October, remember, before the pandemic, we have a lot of problems in Latin America, in many countries across the board. Many social protesters for different regions and reasons. The joke in my part of the world at the time was that to try to improve your situation in Latin America by moving from one country to the other was like trying to improve the situation by shifting cabins in the Titanic. That was the joke at that time. Now we are coming after pandemics. We don't know how the situation is. We have to be very observant. As Joe Nye suggested, being very humble in trying to look, observe, and understand and learn lessons. And we're going there. So what is the connection between this green picture I am presenting with the 3 main ideas of our panels this morning, with democracy, with China, and with artificial intelligence? With democracy, remember, please, that it has 3 legs, as President Lincoln said. You need legitimacy of origin, of the people. You have to be elected, so elections are important. Then you have the second rule for legitimacy, is the way in which you govern, the rule of law, the respect of the Constitution. And the third one is the delivery part, to improve the quality of life of the population for the people. Sometimes we spend a lot of hours talking about elections, which are so important, talking about the rule of law, but we do not spend a lot of time talking about the delivery. What is for me in it, says the normal citizen in our streets. Why should I bet for democracy? What am I receiving? And that's a very important question. So this is one point. In relation to China, I agree with the perception of Beatriz Merino. She was speaking about the situation in Peru, but I think that the perception of the region would be very much like that. Because in the 50s and the 60s, the Americans came to our part of the world. They showed interest in projects, in industries, they invested, they showed concern. President Kennedy created the Alliance for Progress, the Peace Corps volunteers. We had a kind of role to play, but we disappeared from the radar of the United States as a region some decades ago. We don't have any important presence. I remember a debate between the two presidential candidates trying to get the nomination for the Democratic Party some years ago, talking about Latin America, and the debate was concentrated in what is the importance of Latinos in the United States, not the importance of what happens in Latin America over there. Of course, you, Michael, are an exception. You speak Spanish very well. You have taught in our universities over there. You always showed concern, but this is not the attitude of the United States towards our region for a long time. Now we are on the extreme of it. Okay? And the third connection, just a final thought about that. If you leave an empty space, somebody will come and will occupy that space. And that somebody was China since about 2004 until today. So that is the situation. And the third one, in relation to artificial intelligence, the only good news in this green perspective is the importance of the cell phones now. So we are using them to distribute these bonuses, etc. And technology presents a big, big opportunity for the future. But we need to link technology to the social problems of the people more than we are doing today. So 3 conclusions. First, about China. I would suggest to be careful in the language we use to describe a problem and to present solutions. We could leave the impression that we are too defensive in our approach. How to stop this monster? How to avoid them to do A, B, or C? We need more self-reflection. We need to analyze more our own mistakes. We need to be much more proactive. Like with the coronavirus, we need to improve our immune system to be more resistant to any virus. And we can do that by acting, not just observing and commenting. And finally, we are at the verge of a new social contract. And we have done a lot in the technology with our documents. This social contract is inevitably linked with the economic social contract, a new one. And the new social contract on the social aspects. So politics, economy, social, and technology come together. We cannot separate them. And thank you very much for your attention.
Gracias, Emil. Thank you so much. David, the last, but by no means the least. Welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Governor. So I will be very brief because of the hour and because a lot has been said that's very wise and that I certainly agree with. I will just say a couple of words from the perspective of medicine and behavioral neuroscience, as I am wont to do. And I think it really supports this notion of self-reflection that we just heard, which is a higher order prefrontal cortex function of really being able to look at one's own actions and incentives and behavior and to modulate it in a more moral direction. Another concept from behavioral neuroscience that's important is resilience, that was alluded to as well, which is not just the absence of or countering the negative, but the propulsion of the positive and the protective factors, whether in an individual human vis-a-vis mental health or disease, or whether in societies. So we need to mitigate the negative, accentuate the positive, accentuate the prefrontal functions of the human brain, which are more moral, which are more selfless, which are more pro-social, and diminish the reflexic, fear-based, threat-based, us versus them, in-group, out-group tribalism that we've heard about that can be the default, or that people can be manipulated into. That gets to another point. There's the psychology of leaders, including demagogues, and then there's also the reason why people are in the population, and currently we see 30 to 40% in the United States are susceptible to populism and demagoguery and xenophobia. And we need to be able to understand the mechanisms and mitigate those as well. Finally, vis-a-vis China and or any authoritarian regime for that matter at this point, because it's really it has to be seen as the sort of progressive democracies versus this sort of ever-present but resurgent and now AI-enabled and surveillance-enabled set of autocracies. We have to be very clear-eyed because we have to understand the intent and the actions and not be fooled anymore by the words or allow people to be manipulated by the propaganda, including within their own countries, if possible. And so I think that a behavioral approach that Minister Byrne was talking about, at the end of the day, if you're dealing with antisocial behavior, going to get anywhere engaging the person with the usual moral arguments, and their brain literally and their mental state and their psychology doesn't work that way. So, I think seeing really clearly what the actions are on the ground, quite aside from the words of regimes like China, and then counteracting the Belt and Road, the economic debt dependencies, etc., which requires propping up and investing in those countries that are developing, that are vulnerable, that need the infrastructure and the financing. And so I'll just finish by saying that, when you're dealing with pathology, whether it's developing anti-cancer drugs or anti-Alzheimer's drugs, you want to understand all the different and complex interacting parts of the mechanisms and then systematically go after each one. These days, we don't just give one drug for cancer. You give a cocktail, each drug of which targets or tries to counteract a mechanism by which the cancer is undermining the normal cellular machinery or physiologic homeostasis. And so I would say that we need to, as was elucidated earlier in this morning's conversations, really understand the actions that have been taken for the past decade or two increasingly that are now sort of blossoming into plain sight, and then counter them systematically with smart, cohesive action. And that comes back to the notion of what other speakers were saying, that it's only by cohesion and not by being split and divided and manipulated ourselves, or having our populations manipulated, building in those safeguards, and rebuilding the institutions for concerted joint effort or convergent effort of democracies, and then new ways of educating the populace from the point of view of civic education, higher forms of critical thinking, and inoculation, really, against the virus of authoritarianism. So I'll leave it at that, and thank everybody for their patience at this late moment in the discussion.
Said as always, David. Thank you so much. Well, it's been a long morning, folks. We've heard some very, very good people, a lot of wisdom, and a lot of work to do. Now, Tuan, you and
Marc Rotenberg. Marc Rotenberg.
You have an important announcement to make.
Yes.
With Marc Rotenberg. So make that announcement, and we'll wrap up.
Marc.
Yes.
I'm here. Yeah. Marc,
yes.
You're with us.
Yes, please. Today, we are very honored to welcome Marc Rotenberg. He is widely admired international by global leadership in AI policy. He joined with Michael Dukakis Institute as director of Center on AI and Digital Policy. Governor Michael Dukakis, I and our board members of Boston Global Forum and Michael Dukakis Institute, we are warmly welcome and honored to work with Marc. Now, Marc, talk about...
Marc, a few words before we wrap up.
Sure, thank you. Tuan, Governor Dukakis, and everyone, I'm just very pleased to have this opportunity and to work with all of you. We've had good relations over the last few years, and I look forward to building on those relations and making our work more impactful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome home.
Thank you.
And now, Marc, you can talk about Center on AI and Digital Policy. Introduce a little bit.
Well, it will be a little bit because it's been a long morning.
Yeah, about 2 minutes to introduce about.
Folks, we're at a very interesting point in American and world history here. Unprecedented in many ways. And I can't think of a more important task for our center to do than to get deeply and actively involved in this. I share the view of obviously of a number of our speakers and participants that just getting angry at the Chinese is not an answer to this problem. We've got to be a constructive force, a very constructive force in building a world in which people work together, collaborate together, regardless of ideological differences. And we never have needed that more than now. And I see our work as being critical because I'm not hearing much from others on how you do this constructively. It's the old Cold War stuff. We went through that. We can do better. So thank you all so much for being part of this today and the weeks and months ahead. But we and people like us are needed badly to see if we can get this country and this world on a better track. And we'll be working closely with you on so many of the things that we've talked about this morning. Thanks a million. Tuan, thanks to you as always for your work and leadership. And thanks to all of you who participated so valuably in this session this morning. We'll be working closely with you over the course of the next months and years. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Our old people, we have a great conference, and I will stay in touch and discuss more as the Governor Michael Dukakis concludes thing. And also I sent you video of Speaker of Swedish Parliament, Andreas Norlén, because he cannot directly involve, so he sent video. What we have for a long time already, so I will send you video of Andreas Swedish Parliament. Yeah, about 7 minutes. I will send you later. Thank you so much.
Thanks you all, all of you, and we work.
Yes.
Look forward to working with you.
Governor Dukakis, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as the Speaker of the Swedish Parliament, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you today. I can only regret that I cannot be with you in person, but given the current circumstances, that is obviously not an option. And let me, on behalf of the Swedish Parliament, express my sympathy to the people of the United States and to all other countries represented at this conference for all the hardship and the suffering that this terrible corona crisis have caused. Today, some 3 billion people use social media. That is in itself a good thing. The advantages of more and more people going online, learning new things, exchanging ideas, criticizing political policies, or interacting is something the world as a whole will greatly benefit from. The problem is, of course, that not everyone online is honest and everyone is not our friend. There are many attempts to hack our systems and also to hack people's minds. There are strong players who are very interested in what we do on the internet, and the algorithms can track people's actions online and then offer tailor-made news that they think you want and provide you with either fake news or very biased news in order to make you think or vote or act in a certain way. Often the aim is to question our common values such as democracy, rule of law, or personal freedom. We have all heard about how elections in democratic countries have been exposed to this. For this reason, the awareness was quite high in Sweden when we had our last parliamentary elections in 2018. Much to our surprise, no significant external organized hostile influence operations were detected. Maybe the most important advice on how to protect oneself from cyber attacks, disinformation, and organized hostile influence is public awareness. As long as the public is aware that they run the risk of falling victim to those kinds of attacks, I think much has been won. Do some news items seem too good to be true, or maybe too bad to be true? Think again before you share them on social media. That is a very good advice. I know it isn't always easy to apply these virtues, but slowly but surely, I think the Swedes are getting better at this.
Okay, so that is a pack of a video. So we will send you to a video.
That'll be great fun.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Look forward to working with you. We've got much to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you, Coach Hamada. Thank you, President Hamin and Nazli, and also Nobel from Tokyo. So too late now. I know, too late now. But send my heart to Tokyo. My love to Tokyo. Thank you, Nampa.
I'm here.
Thank you.
Very fruitful.
Yes, every people here. Thank you so much for this great event. So we will continue stay in touch and discuss more as we do now. Thank you.